created an unprecedented opportunity to realize our strategic objectives. In the spring of 2019, I became aware of two disruptive actors, primarily Ukraine's then prosecutor Yuri Lutsenko and former Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, President's personal attorney, promoting false narratives that undermined the United States-Ukraine policy. The NSC and its interagency partners, including the State Department, grew increasingly concerned about the impact that such information was having on our country's ability to achieve our national security objectives. On April 21st, 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky was elected president of Ukraine in a landslide victory on a unity, reform, and anti-corruption platform. President Trump called President Zelensky on April 21st, 2019 to congratulate him on his victory. I was the staff officer who produced the call materials and was one of the staff officers who listened to the call. The call was positive, and President Trump expressed his desire to work with President Zelensky and extended an invitation to visit the White House. In May, I attended the inauguration of President Zelensky as part of the presidential delegation led by Secretary Perry. Following the visit, the members of the delegation provided President Trump a debriefing offering a positive assessment of President Zelensky and his team. After this debriefing, President Trump signed a congratulatory letter to President Zelensky and extended another invitation to visit the White House. On July 10, 2019, Alexander Danylyuk, then Ukraine's National Security Advisor, visited Washington, D.C. for a meeting with National Security Advisor Bolton. Ambassadors Volker and Sondland, and Secretary Rick Perry also attended the meeting. I attended with Dr. Hill. We fully anticipated the Ukrainians would raise the issue of a meeting between the presidents. Ambassador Bolton cut the meeting short when Ambassador Sondland started to speak about the requirement that Ukraine deliver specific investigations in order to secure the meeting with President Trump. Following this meeting, there was a short debriefing during which Ambassador Sondland emphasized the importance of Ukraine delivering the investigations into the 2016 elections, the Bidens, and Burisma. I stated to Ambassador Sondland that this was inappropriate and had nothing to do with national security. Dr. Hill also asserted his comments were improper. Following the meeting, Dr. Hill and I agreed to report the incident to NSC's lead counsel, Mr. John Eisenberg. On July 21st, 2019, President Zelensky won a parliamentary election in another landslide victory. The NSC proposed that President Trump call President Zelensky to congratulate him. On July 25th, 2019, the call occurred. I listened on the call in the Situation Room with White House colleagues. I was concerned by the call. What I heard was inappropriate, and I reported my concerns to Mr. Eisenberg. It is improper for the President of the United States to demand a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen and a political opponent. I was also clear that if Ukraine pursued an investigation, it was also clear that if Ukraine pursued an investigation into the 2016 elections, the Bidens and Burisma, it would be interpreted as a partisan play. This would undoubtedly result in Ukraine losing bipartisan support, undermining U.S. national security, and advancing Russia's strategic objectives in the region. I want to emphasize to the committee that when I reported my concerns on July 10th relating to Ambassador Sondland, and then July 25th relating to the President, I did so out of a sense of duty. I privately reported my concerns in official channels to the proper authority in the chain of command. My intent was to raise these concerns because they had significant national security implications for our country. I never thought that I'd be sitting here testifying in front of this committee and the American public about my actions. When I reported my concerns, my only thought was to act properly and to carry out my duty. Following each of my reports to Mr. Eisenberg, I immediately returned to work to advance the President's and our country's foreign policy objectives. I focused on what I have done throughout my military career, promoting America's national security interests. I want to take a moment to recognize the courage of my colleagues who have appeared and are scheduled to appear before this committee. I want to state that the character attacks on these distinguished and honorable public servants is reprehensible. It is natural to disagree and engage in spirited debate, and this has been the custom of our country since the time of our founding fathers. But we are better than personal attacks. The uniform I wear today is that of the United States Army. The members of our all-volunteer force are made up of a patchwork of people from all ethnicities, regions, socioeconomic backgrounds who come together under a common oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States of America. We do not serve any political party, we serve the nation. I am humbled to come before you today as one of many who serve in the most distinguished and able military in the world. The Army is the only profession I've ever known. As a young man, I decided I wanted to spend my life serving this nation and gave my family refuge from authoritarian oppression. For the last 20 years, it has been an honor to represent and protect this great country. Next month will mark 40 years since my family arrived in the United States as refugees. When my father was 47 years old, he left behind his entire life and the only home he had ever known to start over in the United States so his 3 sons could have a better and safer lives. His courageous decision inspired a deep sense of gratitude in my brothers and myself and instilled in us a sense of duty and service. All 3 of us have served or are currently serving in the military. My little brother sits behind me here today. Our collective military service is a special part of our family's history and story in America. I also recognize that my simple act of appearing here today, just like the courage of my colleagues who have also truthfully testified before this committee, would not be tolerated in many places around the world. In Russia, my act of expressing concern to the chain of command in an official and private channel would have severe personal and professional repercussions, and offering public testimony involving the president would surely cost me my life. I'm grateful to for my father's brave act of hope 40 years ago and for the privilege of being an American citizen and public servant, where I can live free of fear for mine and my family's safety. Dad, I'm sitting here today in the U.S. Capitol talking to our elected professionals is proof that you made the right decision 40 years ago to leave the Soviet Union and come here to the United States of America in search of a better life for our family. Do not worry. I will be fine for telling the truth. Thank you again for your consideration. I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Colonel. Thank you, Ms. Williams. Colonel, your brother and family are more than welcome here. We're grateful to have them with us. We will proceed to the first round of questions as detailed in the memo provided to committee members. There will be 45 minutes of questions conducted by the chairman or majority counsel, followed by 45 minutes for the ranking member or minority counsel. Under House Resolution 660, that time may not be delegated to other members. Following that, unless I specify an additional equal time for extended questioning, we will proceed under the 5-minute rule, and every member will have a chance to ask questions. I now recognize myself or majority counsel for the first 45 minutes. Before we get into the substance of your testimony, Ms. Williams, I want to ask you about a phone call between Vice President Pence and President Zelensky of Ukraine on September 18th. Were you on that call?
I was.
And did you take notes of the call?
Yes, sir.
Is there something about that call that you think may be relevant to our investigation?
Mr. Chairman, as we previously discussed with the committee, the Office of the Vice President has taken the position that the September 18th...
Sir, could you move the microphone a little closer to you?
As we've previously discussed with both majority and minority staff of the committee, the Office of the Vice President has taken the position that the September 18th call is classified. As a result, with respect to the call, I'd refer the committee to the public record, which includes Ms. Williams' November 7th testimony, which has been publicly released, as well as the public readout of that call, which has previously been issued by the White House. Beyond that, given the position of the Vice President's office on classification, I've advised Ms. Williams not to answer further questions about that call in an unclassified setting.
Thank you, Counsel. Ms. Williams, I would only ask you in this setting whether you think there's something relevant to our inquiry in that call, and whether, if so, you'll be willing to make a classified submission to the committee.
I would also refer to my testimony that I gave in the closed session, and I'm very happy to appear for a classified setting discussion as well.
It may not be necessary for you to appear if you'll be willing to submit the information in writing to the committee.
I'd be happy to do so.
Thank you. Colonel Vindman, if I could turn your attention to the April 21st call, that is the first call between President Trump and President Zelensky. Did you prepare talking points for the President to use during that call?
Yes, I did.
And did those talking points include rooting out corruption in Ukraine?
Yes.
That was something the President was supposed to raise in the conversation with President Zelensky?
Those were the recommended talking points that were cleared through the NSC staff for the President, yes.
Did you listen in on that call?
Yes, I did.
The White House has now released the record of that call. Did President Trump ever mention corruption in the April 21st call?
To the best of my recollection, he did not.
On the April 21st call, President Trump told President Zelensky that he would send a high-level U.S. delegation to the inauguration. Following that call, Ms. Williams, was your understanding that the President wanted the Vice President to attend the inauguration in Kyiv?
Yes, that was my understanding.
And did the President subsequently tell the Vice President not to attend the inauguration?
I was informed by our Chief of Staff's office, by the Vice President's Chief of Staff's office, that the President had told the Vice President not to attend. I did not witness that conversation.
And am I correct that you learned this on May 13th? Is that right?
That's correct.
Am I also correct that the inauguration date had not been set by May 13th?
That's correct.
Do you know what accounted for the President's decision to instruct the Vice President not to attend?
I do not.
Colonel Vindman, you were a member of the U.S. delegation to the inauguration on May 20th, is that correct?
Yes, Chairman.
And during that trip, did you have an opportunity to offer any advice to President Zelensky?
Yes, Chairman.
What was the advice that you gave him?
During a bilateral meeting in which the whole delegation was meeting with President Zelensky and his team, I offered two pieces of advice. To be particularly cautious with regards to Ukraine, to be particularly cautious with regards to Russia and its desire to provoke Ukraine, and the second one was to stay out of U.S. domestic policy.
Do you mean politics?
Politics, correct.
And why did you feel it was necessary to advise President Zelensky to stay away from U.S. domestic politics?
Chairman, in the March and April timeframe, became clear that there were actors in the U.S. Public actors, non-governmental actors, that were promoting the idea of investigations and 2016 Ukrainian interference, and it was consistent with U.S. policy to advise any country, all the countries in my portfolio, any country in the world, to not participate in U.S. domestic politics. So I was passing the same advice consistent with U.S. policy.
I know Mr. Goldman will have more questions about that when I turn to him. But let me turn, if I can, to the hold on security assistance, which I think you both testified you learned about in early July. Am I correct that neither of you were provided with a reason for why the President put a hold on security assistance to Ukraine?
My understanding was that OMB was reviewing the assistance to ensure it was in line with administration priorities, but it was not made more specific than that.
Colonel Vindman?
That is consistent. The review was to ensure it remained consistent with administration policies.
Colonel Vindman, you attended a meeting in John Bolton's office on July 10th, where Ambassador Sondland interjected to respond to a question by senior Ukrainian officials about a White House visit. What did he say at that time?
To the best of my recollection, Ambassador Sondland said that in order to get a White House meeting, the Ukrainians would have to provide a deliverable, which is investigations, specific investigations.
And what was Ambassador Bolton's response or reaction to that comment?
We had not completed all of the agenda items, and we still had time for the meeting, and Ambassador Bolton abruptly ended the meeting.
Did you report this incident to the National Security Council lawyers?
Yes, I did.
Based on Ambassador Sondland's remark at the July 10th meeting, was it your clear understanding that the Ukrainians understood they had to commit to investigations President Trump wanted in order to get the White House meeting?
It may have not been entirely clear at that moment. Certainly, Ambassador Sondland was calling for these meetings, and he had stated that this was developed per a conversation with the Chief of Staff, Mr. Mick Mulvaney, but the connection to the President wasn't clear at that point.
But the import of what Ambassador Sondland said during that meeting was that there was an agreement with Mick Mulvaney that Zelensky would get the meeting if they would undertake these investigations.
That is correct.
About 2 weeks after that July 10th meeting, President Trump and President Zelensky had their second call, the now infamous July 25th call. Colonel Vindman, what was your real-time reaction to hearing that call?
Chairman, without hesitation, I knew that I had to report this to the White House counsel. I had concerns, and it was my duty to report my concerns to the proper people in the chain of command.
And what was your concern?
Well, Chairman, as I said in my statement, it was inappropriate, it was improper for the President to request and to demand an investigation into a political opponent, especially a foreign power where there's at best dubious belief that this would be a completely impartial investigation, and that this would have significant implications if it became public knowledge, and it would be perceived as a partisan play. It would undermine our Ukraine policy, and it would undermine our national security.
Now, Colonel, you've described this as a demand, this favor that the President asked. What is it about the relationship between the President of the United States and the President of Ukraine that leads you to conclude that when the President of the United States asks a favor like this, it's really a demand?
Chairman, the culture I come from, the military culture, when a senior asks you to do something, even if it's polite and pleasant, it's not to be taken as a request. It's to be taken as an order. In this case, the power disparity between the two leaders, my impression is that in order to get the White House meeting, President Zelensky would have to deliver these investigations.
Ms. Williams, I think you described your reaction in your deposition as, when you listened to the call, as you found it unusual and inappropriate. But I was struck by something else you said in your deposition. You said that it shed some light on possible other motivations behind a security assistance hold. What did you mean by that?
Mr. Chairman, I was asked during the closed-door testimony how I felt about the call, and in reflecting on what I was thinking in that moment, it was the first time I had heard internally the President reference particular investigations that previously I had only heard about through Mr. Giuliani's press interviews in press reporting. So in that moment, it was not clear whether there was a direct connection or linkage between the ongoing hold on security assistance and what the President may be asking President Zelensky to undertake in regard to investigations. It was noteworthy in that regard. I did not have enough information to draw any firm conclusions.
But it raised a question in your mind as to whether the two were related.
It was the first I had heard of any requests of Ukraine which were that specific in nature. So it was noteworthy to me in that regard.
Both of you recall President Zelensky in that conversation raising the issue or mentioning Burisma, do you not?
That's correct.
Correct.
And yet the word Burisma appears nowhere in the call record that's been released to the public. Is that right?
That's right.
Correct.
Do you know why that's the case? Why that was left out?
I do not. I was not involved in the production of that transcript.
I attribute that to the fact that this transcript that is being produced may have not caught the word Burisma, and it was in the transcript that was released. It was released as the company, which is accurate. It's not a significant omission.
But Colonel, you pointed out the fact that that word was used, did you not?
Correct.
And yet it was not included in the record released to the public.
That's right. It's I'd say it's informed speculation that the folks that produce these transcripts do the best they can, and they just didn't catch the word, and that was my responsibility to then make sure that the transcript was as accurate as possible, and that's what I attempted to do by putting that word back in, because that was in my notes.
I think, Colonel, you testified in your deposition that you found it striking that Zelensky would bring up Burisma, that it indicated to you that he had been prepped for the call, to expect this issue to come up. What led you to that conclusion?
It seemed unlikely that he would be familiar with a single company in the context of a call that was on the broader bilateral relationship. And it seemed to me that he was either tracking this issue because it was in the press or he was otherwise prepped.
Mr. Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
On July 25th at approximately 9 a.m., you both were sitting in the Situation Room, probably not too much further away than you are right now. And you were preparing for a long-awaited phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky. Now, Colonel Vindman, in advance of this phone call, did you prepare talking points as you did for the April 21st call?
Yes, I did.
What were those talking points based upon?
They were, so this is not in the public record, and I can't comment too deeply, but what is, the areas that we've consistently talked about in public is cooperation on supporting his reform agenda, anti-corruption efforts, and helping President Zelensky implement his plans to end Russia's war against Ukraine.
In other words, they're based on official U.S. policy?
Correct.
And is there a process to determine official U.S. policy?
Yes, that is my job, is to coordinate U.S. policy. So throughout the preceding year that I've been on staff, I had undertaken an effort to make sure we had a cohesive, coherent U.S. policy.
And as you listened to the call, did you observe whether President Trump was following the talking points based on the official U.S. policy?
Counsel, the president could choose to use the talking points or not. He's the president, but they were not consistent with what I provided, yes.
Let's take a look at a couple of excerpts from this call. And right after President Zelensky thanked President Trump for the United States support in the area of defense, President Trump asks President Zelensky for a favor and then raises this theory of Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election. He says in the highlighted portion, "I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot and Ukraine knows a lot about it. I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation with Ukraine. They say CrowdStrike. I guess you have one of your wealthy people. The server, they say Ukraine has it." Now, Colonel Vindman, was this statement based on the official talking points that you had prepared?
No.
And was this statement related to the 2016 Ukraine interference in the 2016 election part of the official U.S. policy?
No, it was not.
Now, at the time of this July 25th call, Colonel Vindman, were you aware of a theory that Ukraine had intervened or interfered in the 2016 U.S. election?
I was.
Are you aware of any credible evidence to support this theory?
I am not.
Are you also aware that Vladimir Putin had promoted this theory of Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election?
I am well aware of that fact.
And ultimately, which country did U.S. intelligence services determine to have interfered in the 2016 election?
It is the consensus of the entire intelligence community that the Russians interfered in U.S. elections in 2016.
Let's go to another excerpt from this call where President Trump asked President Zelensky to investigate his political opponent, Vice President Joe Biden. Here, President Trump says, the other thing, there's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of people want to find out about that. So whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution, so if you can look into it. It sounds horrible to me, he said. Again, Colonel Vindman, was this included in your talking points?
It was not.
Is such a request to investigate a political opponent consistent with official U.S. policy?
It was not consistent with the policy as I understood it.
Now, are you aware of any credible allegations or evidence to support this notion that Vice President Biden did something wrong or against U.S. policy with regard to Ukraine?
I am not.
Ms. Williams, are you familiar with any credible evidence to support this theory against Vice President Biden?
No, I'm not.
Now, Ms. Williams, prior to the July 25th call, approximately how many calls between the President of the United States and foreign leaders had you listened to?
I would say roughly a dozen.
Had you ever heard a call like this?
As I testified before, I believe what I found unusual or different about this call was the president's reference to specific investigations, and that struck me as different than other calls I had listened to.
You testified that you thought it was political in nature. Why did you think that?
I thought that the references to specific individuals and investigations, such as former Vice President Biden and his son, struck me as political in nature, given that the former Vice President is a political opponent of the President.
And so you thought that it could potentially be designed to assist President Trump's reelection effort?
I can't speak to what the President's motivation was in referencing it, but I just noted that the reference to Biden sounded political to me.
Colonel Vindman, you said in your deposition that it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see the political benefits of the president's demands. For those of us who are not rocket scientists, can you explain what you meant by that?
So my understanding is that it was the connection to investigate into a political opponent was inappropriate and improper. I made that connection as soon as the president brought up the Biden investigation.
Colonel Vindman, you testified that President Trump's request for a favor from President Zelensky would be considered as a demand to President Zelensky. After this call, did you ever hear from any Ukrainians, either in the United States or Ukraine, about any pressure that they felt to do these investigations that President Trump demanded?
Not that I can recall.
Did you have any discussions with officials at the embassy here, the Ukrainian embassy here in Washington, D.C.?
Yes, I did.
Did you discuss at all the demand for investigations with them?
I did not.
Did you discuss at all, at any point, their concerns about the hold on security assistance?
To the best of my recollection, in the August timeframe, the Ukrainian embassy started to become aware of the hold on security assistance, and they were asking if I had any comment on that or if I could substantiate that.
And that was before it became public, is that right?
Yes.
And what did you respond?
I believe I said that I don't recall, frankly. I don't recall what I said, but I believe it may have been something along the lines of I'm not aware of it.
You testified that one of your concerns about the request for investigations related to U.S. domestic politics was that Ukraine may lose bipartisan support. And why was that a concern of yours?
Ukraine is in a war with Russia, and the security assistance that we provide Ukraine is significant. Absent that security assistance, and maybe even more importantly, the signal of support for Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, that would likely encourage Russia to potentially escalate, to pursue further aggression, further undermining Ukrainian sovereignty, European security, and U.S. security.
So, in other words, Ukraine is heavily dependent on United States support, both diplomatically, financially, and also militarily.
Correct.
Colonel Vindman, what languages do you speak?
I speak Russian and Ukrainian, and a little bit of English.
Do you recall what language President Zelensky spoke on this July 25th phone call?
I know he made a valiant effort to speak English. He had been practicing up his English, but he also spoke Ukrainian.
I want to look at the third excerpt from the July 25th call. And Chairman Schiff addressed this with you in his questioning. And you see in the highlighted portion, it says specifically to the company that you mentioned in this issue. Is that the portion of the call record that, Colonel Vindman, you thought President Zelensky actually said Burisma?
Correct.
And you testified earlier that his use of, or his understanding that when President Trump mentioned the Bidens, that referred to the company Burisma, sounded to you like he was prepped or prepared for this call. Is that right?
That is correct.
I want to go to the next slide, if we could, which is actually a text message that neither of you is on, but this is from Ambassador Kurt Volker to Andrei Yermak. And Colonel Vindman, who's Andrei Yermak?
Andrei Yermak is a senior advisor within the presidential administration to Ukrainian presidential administration. He's a senior advisor to President Zelensky.
Now, this text message is less than a half hour before the call on July 25th. And since neither of you are on it, I'll read it. It says from Ambassador Volker, "Good lunch, thanks. Heard from White House. Assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate, quote, get to the bottom of what happened, unquote, in 2016, we will nail down date for visit to Washington. Good luck. See you tomorrow, Kurt." Now, is this the sort of thing that you're referring to when you say that it sounded like President Zelensky was prepared for this call?
This would be consistent, yes.
Now, turning to the fourth excerpt from the July 25th call, where Ukraine's President Zelensky links the White House meeting to the investigations that President Trump requests. President Zelensky says, "I also wanted to thank you for your invitation to visit the United States, specifically Washington, D.C. On the other hand, I also wanted to assure you that we will be very serious about the case and will work on the investigation." Colonel Vindman, when President Zelensky says, "on the other hand," would you agree that he's acknowledging a linkage between the White House visit that he mentions in the first sentence and the investigations that he mentions in the second sentence?
It could be taken that way. I'm not sure if it seems like a reasonable conclusion.
And if that is the case, that would be consistent with the text message that Ambassador Volker sent to Andrei Yermak right before the call. Is that right?
Seemingly so.
Now, you've testified in your deposition that a White House visit, an Oval Office visit, is very important to President Zelensky. Why is that?
The show of support for President Zelensky, still a brand new president, frankly, a new politician on the Ukrainian political scene, looking to establish his bona fides as a regional and maybe even a world leader, would want to have a meeting with the United States, the most powerful country in the world, and Ukraine's most significant benefactor, in order to be able to implement his agenda.
It would provide him with some additional legitimacy at home?
Yes.
So just to summarize, in this July 25th call between the presidents of the United States and Ukraine, President Trump demanded a favor of President Zelensky to conduct investigations that both of you acknowledge were for President Trump's political interest, not the national interest, and in return for his promise of a much-desired White House meeting for President Zelensky. Colonel Vindman, is that an accurate summary of the excerpts that we just looked at?
Yes.
Ms. Williams?
Yes.
Colonel Vindman, you immediately reported this call to the NSC lawyers. Why did you do that?
So at this point, I had already been tracking this initially, what I would describe as alternative narrative, false narrative, and I was certainly aware of the fact that it was starting to reverberate, gain traction. The fact that it, in the July 10th call, ended up being pronounced by a public official, Ambassador Sondland, had me alerted to this, and I was, subsequent to that report, I was invited to follow up with any other concerns to Mr. Eisenberg.
And we're going to discuss that July 10th meeting in a moment, but when you say alternative false narratives, are you referring to the two investigations that President Trump referenced in the call?
Yes.
Now, at some point, did you also discuss how the written summary of the call record should be handled with the NSC lawyers?
There was, following the report, there was a discussion in the legal shop on the best way to manage the transcript, yes.
What did you understand they concluded?
My understanding is that this was viewed as a sensitive transcript, and to avoid leaks, and if I recall the term properly, or something along the lines of preserve the integrity of the transcript, it should be segregated to a smaller group of folks.
To preserve the integrity of the transcript, what did that mean?
I'm not sure. I mean, it seems like a legal term. I'm not an attorney, but it was. I didn't take it as anything nefarious. I understood that they wanted to keep it in a smaller group.
If there was real interest in preserving the integrity of the transcript, don't you think they would have accepted your correction that Burisma should have been included?
Not necessarily. The way these edits occur, they go through, like everything else, a approval process. I made my contribution. It was cleared by Mr. Morrison. Then when I returned it, you know, sometimes that doesn't happen. There are administrative errors. I think that in this case, I didn't see it. When I first saw the transcript without the two substantive items that I had attempted to include, I didn't see that as nefarious. I just saw it as, okay, no big deal. You know, these might be meaningful, but it's not that big a deal.
You said two substantive issues. What was the other one?
There was a reference in a section. One second. Yeah. On page 4, the top paragraph, let me find the right spot. Okay. Yes. You can look into it. Ellipse. There are videos, so is what I recall. Or the recordings.
Instead of an ellipses, it should have said, to what you heard, that there are recordings?
Correct.
Did you ultimately learn where the call record was put?
I understood that it was being segregated into a separate system, separate secure system.
Why would it be put on a separate secure system?
This is definitely not unprecedented, but at times, if you want to limit access to a smaller group of folks, you put it on the secure system to ensure that a smaller group of people with access to the secure system have it.
But can't you also limit the number of people who can access it on the regular system?
You can do that, but to the best of my recollection, the decision was made, frankly, on the fly after the fact after I conveyed my concerns to Mr. Eisenberg. Mr. Ellis came in. He hadn't heard the entire conversation, and when it was mentioned that it was sensitive, it was kind of on the fly decision to just segregate it in this other system.
Mr. Eisenberg and Mr. Ellis are the NSC lawyers?
Correct.
But it was your understanding that it was not a mistake to put it on the highly classified system, is that right?
I'm not sure I understand.
Was it intended to be put on the highly classified system by the lawyers? Or was it a mistake that it was put there?
I think it was intended, but again, it was intended to prevent leaks and to limit access.
Now, you testified, both of you, about the April 21st call a little earlier. And Colonel Vindman, you indicated that you did include in your talking points the idea of Ukraine rooting out corruption, but that President Trump did not mention corruption. I want to go to the White House readout from the April 21st call. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you see the highlighted portion where it says root out corruption?
Yes.
So in the end, this readout was false, is that right?
Maybe that's a bit of it's not entirely accurate, but I'm not sure if I would describe it as false. It was consistent with U.S. policy, and these items are used as messaging tools also. So a statement that goes out, in addition to reading out the meeting itself, is also a messaging platform to indicate what is important with regards to U.S. policy.
So it is a part of U.S. official policy that Ukraine should root out corruption, even if President Trump did not mention it in that April 21st phone call. Is that right?
Certainly.
And he also did not mention it in the July 25th phone call. Is that right?
Correct.
So even though it was included in his talking points for the April 21st call, and presumably even though you can't talk about it for the July 21st call, it was not included in either. Is that right?
For the April 21st call.
He did not mention it in either, rather.
Correct.
So when the president says now that he held up security assistance because he was concerned about rooting out corruption in Ukraine, that concern was not expressed in the 2 phone conversations that he had with President Zelensky earlier this year. Is that right?
Correct.
Now, Ms. Williams, you testified that earlier that after this April 21st call, President Trump asked Vice President Pence to attend President Zelensky's inauguration. Is that right?
That's correct.
And that on May 13th, you were just informed by the Chief of Staff's office that Vice President Pence will not be going per request of the President. Is that right?
That's what I was informed, yes.
And you didn't know what had changed from April 21st to May 13th. Is that right?
No, not in terms of that decision.
Well, Colonel Vindman, since you in particular a little bit more perhaps than Ms. Williams, who has a broader portfolio, focuses on Ukraine, I want to ask you if you were aware of the following things that happened from April 21st to May 13th. Were you aware that Ambassador Yovanovitch was abruptly recalled from Ukraine in that time?
Yes.
Were you aware that President Trump...
I'm sorry to correct it. So she was recalled prior, let me see. So the notification occurred towards the end of April, and she was finally recalled in May timeframe, I think May 20th, if I recall correctly.
So she learned about it after April 21st, on April 24th, is that right?
Correct.
And were you aware that President Trump had a telephone call with President Putin during this time period in early May?
I was.
And were you aware that Rudy Giuliani had planned a trip to go to Ukraine to pressure the Ukrainians to initiate the 2 investigations that President Trump mentioned on the July 25th call in this time period?
I was aware that he was traveling there and that he had been promoting the idea of these investigations.
I want to move now to that July 10th meeting that you referenced, Colonel Vindman, what exactly did Ambassador Sondland say when the Ukrainian officials raised the idea of a White House meeting?
As I recall, he referred to specific investigations that Ukrainians would have to deliver in order to get these meetings.
And what happened to
the White House meeting?
What happened to the broader meeting after he made that reference?
Ambassador Bolton very abruptly ended the meeting.
And did you have any conversations with Ambassador Bolton about this meeting?
No, I did not.
Did you follow Ambassador Sondland and the others to the wardroom for a meeting follow-up?
There was a photo opportunity that we leveraged in order to demonstrate U.S. support. So the White House visit demonstrating U.S. support for Ukraine and the new National Security Advisor, who's a technocrat. And then after that, we went down to a short post-meeting huddle or debrief.
Were the investigations, the specific investigations that Ambassador Sondland referenced in the larger meeting also discussed in the wardroom meeting?
They were.
What did Ambassador Sondland say?
Ambassador Sondland referred to investigations into the Biden's Burisma in 2016.
How did you respond, if at all?
I said that this request to conduct these meetings was inappropriate. These investigations was inappropriate and had nothing to do with national security policy.
Was Ambassador Volker in this meeting as well?
I don't recall specifically. I believe he was there for at least a portion of the time. I don't recall if he was there for that the whole meeting.
Was this statement made in front of the Ukrainian officials?
I believe there was some discussion prior to the Ukrainians leaving, when it was apparent there was some discord between the senior folks, Ambassador Sondland, and other White House staff, myself. They were asked to step out. So I don't recall if they were there for the entire discussion.
The senior White House staff you're referring to, does that include Fiona Hill, your immediate supervisor at the time?
Correct.
Now, you said you also reported this incident to the NSC lawyers, is that right?
Correct.
And what was their response?
John Eisenberg said that he took notes while I was talking, and he said that he would look into it.
Why did you report this meeting and this conversation to the NSC lawyers?
Because it was inappropriate, and following the meeting, I had a short conversation following the post-meeting meeting in the wardroom. I had a short conversation with Dr. Hill, and we discussed the idea of needing to report this.
So am I correct, Colonel Vindman, that at least no later than that July 10th meeting, the Ukrainians had understood, or at least heard, that the Oval Office meeting that they so desperately wanted was conditioned on these specific investigations into Burisma and the 2016 election?
That was the first time I was aware of the Ukrainians being approached directly by a government official.
And directly linking the White House meeting to the investigations?
Correct.
Ms. Williams, you testified that in your opening statement that you attended the September 1st meeting between Vice President Pence and President Zelensky in Warsaw. Is that right?
That's correct.
What was the first thing that President Zelensky asked Vice President Pence about at that meeting?
President Zelensky asked the Vice President about the status of security assistance for Ukraine because he had seen the Politico article and other news reporting that the security assistance was being held.
And you testified in your deposition that in that conversation, President Zelensky emphasized that the military assistance, the security assistance, was not just important to assist Ukraine in fighting a war against Russia, but that it was also symbolic in nature. What did you understand him to mean by that?
President Zelensky explained that more than, or just equally with the financial and physical value of the assistance, that it was the symbolic nature of that assistance that really was the show of U.S. support for Ukraine and for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I think he was stressing that to the Vice President to really underscore the need for the security assistance to be released.
And that if the United States was holding the security assistance, is it also true then that Russia could see that as a sign of weakening U.S. support for Ukraine and take advantage of that?
I believe that's what the President Zelensky was indicating, that any signal or sign that U.S. support was wavering would be construed by Russia as potentially an opportunity for them to strengthen their own hand in Ukraine.
Did Vice President Pence provide a reason for the hold on security assistance to the Ukrainian president in that meeting?
The Vice President did not specifically discuss the reason behind the hold, but he did reassure President Zelensky of the strongest U.S. unwavering support for Ukraine, and they talked about the need for European countries to step up and provide more assistance to Ukraine as well.
Did Vice President Pence report back to President Trump on that meeting, to your knowledge?
The Vice President conveyed to President Zelensky that he would follow up with President Trump that evening and convey to President Trump what he had heard from President Zelensky with regard to his efforts to implement reforms in Ukraine. I am aware that the Vice President spoke to President Trump that evening, but I was not privy to the conversation.
Are you also aware, however, that the security assistance hold was not lifted for another 10 days after this meeting?
That's correct.
And am I correct that you didn't learn the reason why the hold was lifted?
That's correct.
Colonel Vindman, you didn't learn a reason why the hold was lifted either, is that right?
Correct.
Colonel Vindman, are you aware that the committees launched an investigation into Ukraine matters on September 9th, 2 days before the hold was lifted?
I am aware, and I was aware.
And on September 10th, the Intelligence Committee requested the whistleblower complaint from the Department of National Intelligence. Are you aware of that?
I don't believe I was aware of that.
Were you aware that the White House was aware of this whistleblower complaint prior to that date?
The first I heard of the whistleblower complaint is, I believe, when the news broke. I was only aware of the committees investigating the hold on security assistance.
So is it accurate to say, Colonel Vindman, that whatever reason that was provided for the hold, including the administrative policies, which would support the hold, would support the security assistance, is that right, to your understanding?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that.
I was just asking that the administrative policies of President Trump supported the security assistance. Is that your understanding?
So the interagency policy was to support security assistance for Ukraine.
Thank you. I yield back.
Now recognize Ranking Member Nunes or Minority Counsel for 45 minutes.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. Welcome. I want to just establish a few basic facts about your knowledge, Ukraine, Burisma, and the role of the Bidens.
Yes, sir.
You spend an extraordinary amount of your time on Ukraine, correct? Ukraine
is one of the countries in my portfolio. I would not say an extraordinary amount of time, but certainly the Vice President has engaged on Ukraine policy quite a bit in my 8 months.
And it's in your portfolio.
That's correct.
First off, were you aware in September of 2015, then U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, publicly called for an investigation into Zlochevsky, the president of Burisma. Were you aware of these public statements?
No, not at the time.
You are today, though.
I've since heard them, yes.
Did you know of anti-Trump efforts by various Ukrainian officials as well as Alexander Chalupa, a DNC consultant?
No, I was not aware.
Did you know about the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Kent's concerns about potential conflict of interest into Hunter Biden sitting on the board of Burisma?
I did not work on Ukraine policy during that time frame, so I've become aware of it through.
In the last year or so?
I've become aware of it through Mr. Kent's testimony through this process.
Did you know that financial records show a Ukrainian natural gas company, Burisma, routed more than $3 million to American accounts tied to Hunter Biden?
No, I was not aware.
Until you prepared for this hearing?
Until others have been testifying in more detail on those issues. That's correct.
You've been following it more closely.
Correct.
Did you know that Burisma's American legal representatives met with Ukrainian officials just days after Vice President Biden forced the firing of the country's chief prosecutor?
Again, sir, I was not working on Ukraine policy during that time. So
And none of these are trick questions. I'm just trying to get through them.
I understand. Yeah.
Did you know that Burisma lawyers pressured the State Department in February 2016 after the raid and month before the firing of Shokin, and that they invoked Hunter Biden's name as a reason to intervene?
I was not aware.
Did you know that Joe Biden called Ukrainian President Poroshenko at least 3 times in February 2016 after the president and owner of Burisma's home was raided on February 2nd by the state prosecutor's office?
Not at the time. Again, I've become aware of that through this proceeding.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, I'm going to ask you same questions just to establish some basic facts about your knowledge about Ukraine, Burisma, and the role of the Bidens. In September 2015, U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine Jeffrey Pyatt publicly called for an investigation into Slashevsky, the president of Burisma. Were you aware of these public statements?
I wasn't aware of them at the time.
When did you become aware of them?
During the course of the testimony and the depositions after this impeachment inquiry began.
Did you know of anti-Trump efforts by various Ukrainian government officials as well as Alexander Chalupa, a DNC consultant?
I'm not aware of any of these interference efforts.
Did you know about Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Kent's concerns about potential conflict of interest with Hunter Biden sitting on the board of Burisma?
The only thing I'm aware of is pertains to his deposition.
Did you know that financial records show a Ukrainian natural gas company, Burisma, routed more than $3 million to the American accounts tied to Hunter Biden?
I'm not aware of this fact.
Until recently.
I guess I didn't independently look into it. I'm just not aware of what kind of payments Mr. Biden may have received. This is not something I'm aware of.
Did you know that Burisma's American legal representatives met with Ukrainian officials just days after Vice President Biden forced the firing of the country's chief prosecutor?
I'm not aware of these meetings.
Did you know that Burisma lawyers pressured the State Department in February 2016 after the raid and a month before the firing of Shokin, that they invoked Hunter Biden's name as a reason to intervene?
I'm not aware of any of these facts.
Did you know that Joe Biden called Ukrainian President Poroshenko at least 3 times in February 2016 after the president and owner of Burisma's home was raided on February 2nd by the state prosecutor's office?
I'm aware of the fact that President Biden, or Vice President Biden, was very engaged on Ukraine and had numerous engagements. That's what I'm aware of.
Ms. Williams and Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, as you may or may not know, this committee has spent nearly 3 years conducting various investigations, starting with the Russia collusion hoax, FISA abuse, Democratic hysteria over the lack of collusion in the Mueller report, and now this impeachment charade. One of the most concerning things regarding all of these investigations is the amount of classified or otherwise sensitive information I read in the press that derive either from this committee or sources in the administration. To be clear, I'm not accusing either one of you of leaking information. However, given that you are the first witnesses who actually have some firsthand knowledge of the president's call by listening in on July 25th, it's imperative to the American public's understanding of the events that we get a few matters out of the way first. Ms. Williams, let me just go to you first. For the purposes of the following questions, I'm only asking about the time period from July 25th to September 25th.
Okay.
Did you discuss the July 25th phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky or any matters associated with the phone call with any members of the press?
No.
To be clear, you never discussed these matters with the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, CNN, or any other media outlet?
No, I did not.
Did you ask or encourage any individual to share the substance of the July 25th phone call or any matter associated with the call with any member of the press?
I did not.
Do you know of any individual who discussed the substance of the July 25th phone call or matter associated with the call with any member of the press?
No, I do not.
Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, the same questions for you. Did you discuss the July 25th phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky or any matter associated with the phone call with any member of the press?
I did not.
Just to be clear, you did not discuss this with the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, CNN, or any other media outlet?
I did not.
Did you ask or encourage any individual to share the substance of the July 25th phone call or any matter associated with the call with any member of the press?
I did not.
Do you know of any individual who discussed the substance of the July 25th phone call or any matter associated with the call with any member of the press?
We have an NSC press shop, and they field any of these types of questions. I do not engage with the press at all.
Let me ask the question again. Do you know of any individual who discussed the substance of the July 25th phone call or any matter associated with the call with any member of the press?
We have an NSC press shop whose job is to engage on any of these types of questions. I am not aware, but it is possible and likely that the press shop would field these types of questions.
Right, but the question is,
I'm sorry.
The question is, do you know any individual, do you personally know any individual who discussed the substance of the July 25th phone call or any matter associated with the call with any member of the press?
Thank you, Ranking Member, for clarifying. I do not.
Thank you. Ms. Williams, did you discuss the July 25th phone call with anyone outside the White House on July 25th or July 26th, and if so, with whom?
No, I did not discuss the call with anyone outside or inside the White House.
Ms. Williams, during your time on the NSC, have you ever accessed a colleague's work computer without their prior authorization or approval?
I have not, and just to clarify, I'm in the Office of the Vice President, so not on the NSC.
Right, but representing
No,
the
I have
Vice
not.
President.
No.
Thank you for that clarification. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, did you discuss the July 25th phone call with anyone outside the White House on July 25th or the 26th? And if so, with whom?
Yes, I did. My core function is to coordinate U.S. government policy, interagency policy, and I spoke to two individuals with regards to providing some sort of readout of the call.
Two individuals that were not in the White House.
Not in the White House, cleared U.S. government officials with appropriate need to know.
And what agencies were these officials with?
Department of State, Deputy Assistant Secretary George Kent, who is responsible for the portfolio Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, and an individual from the Office of an individual in the intelligence community.
As you know, the intelligence community has 17 different agencies. What agency was this individual from?
If I could interject here, we don't want to use these proceedings.
It's our time,
I know,
Mr. Chair.
but we need to protect the whistleblower.
Please stop.
I want to make sure that there's no effort to out the whistleblower through the use of these proceedings. If the witness has a good faith belief that this may reveal the identity of the whistleblower, that is not the purpose that we are here for, and I want to advise the witness accordingly.
Mr. Vindman, you testified in your deposition that you did not know the whistleblower.
Ranking Member, it's Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, please.
Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, you testified in the deposition that you did not know who the whistleblower was, or is.
I do not know who the whistleblower is. That is
So how is it possible for you to name these people and then out the whistleblower?
Per the advice of my counsel, I've been advised not to answer specific questions about members of the intelligence community.
Are you aware that this is the Intelligence Committee that's conducting an impeachment hearing?
Of course I am.
Wouldn't the appropriate place for you to come to testify would be the Intelligence Committee about someone within the intelligence community?
Ranking member, per the advice of my counsel and the instructions from the chairman, I've been advised not to provide any specifics on who I've spoken to inside the intelligence community. What I can offer is that these were properly cleared individuals, or was a properly cleared individual with a need to know.
Well, this is, I mean, you can plead the fifth, but you're here to answer questions and you're here under subpoena. So you can either answer the question or you can plead the fifth.
Excuse me. On behalf of my client, we are following the rule of the committee, the rule of the chair with regard to this issue. And this does not call for an answer that is invoking the fifth or any theoretical issue like that. We're following the ruling of the chair.
Counselor, what ruling is that?
If I could interject, counsel is correct. Whistleblower has the right, statutory right to anonymity. These proceedings will not be used to out the whistleblower.
And I've advised my client accordingly, and he's going to follow the ruling of the chair. If there's an alternative or you want to work something out with the chair, that's up to you, Mr. Nunes.
Well, we've attempted to subpoena the whistleblower to sit for a deposition. The chair has tabled that motion and then has been unwilling to recognize those motions over the last few days of this impeachment inquisition process. Well, that I'll go to Mr. Castor.
Thank you, Ranking Member Nunes. The call transcript as published on September 25th is complete and accurate. Will both of you attest to that, Ms. Williams?
I didn't take a word-for-word accounting. When I first saw the publicly released version, it looked substantively correct to me.
And Colonel Vindman?
I think I certainly would describe it as substantively correct.
I think in your testimony, your deposition, you said very accurate?
Correct.
Okay. And you flagged a couple edits, Colonel Vindman. I think you had Burisma on page 4, where President Zelensky was talking about the company mentioned in the issue.
I'm sorry, could you say that question
I believe
again?
in your testimony you explained that you offered an edit that on page 4 of the transcript that was ultimately published, you thought President Zelensky mentioned the word Burisma.
Oh, I had it in my notes. I know that's what he said, yes.
Okay. And Ms. Williams, and that was on page 4, correct?
Correct.
And Ms. Williams, I believe after your deposition you went back and checked your notes and you had President Zelensky using the term Burisma as well. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But that came up on a different part of the transcript than what Colonel Vindman was relating to, correct?
Yes, I believe so.
Yours came up on page 5, and it would have been in substitution for the word case?
That's right. That's where I have it in my notes.
Okay. Colonel Vindman, we've had some discussion earlier today and also at your deposition about whether the president had a demand for President Zelensky. And, you know, I suggested to you in the deposition that the president's words are in fact ambiguous. And he uses some phrases that certainly could be characterized as hedging. On page 3, in the first paragraph, he talks about whatever you can do. He talks about if that's possible. On page 4, he mentions if you could speak to him. He's talking about the Attorney General or Rudy Giuliani. And then at the end of the first paragraph on page 4, he says whatever you can do. The president also says, you know, if you can look into it. And I asked you during your deposition whether you saw or acknowledged the fact that certain people could read that to be ambiguous.
And I said correct, yes.
And I believe you said, I think people want to hear what they have already preconceived. Is that what you testified?
Actually, if I could ask for just a page cite.
256.
256
Yeah.
and a line. Thank you. Just a minute, please.
And
Just a minute. Okay, we got the page.
okay. And then you went on to say, yeah, you agreed with me. You said, yeah, I guess you could interpret it different ways. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Turning attention to the preparation of the transcript, that followed in the ordinary process, correct?
So I think it followed the appropriate process in terms of making sure that eventually it came around for clearances, for accuracy,
Okay.
but it was in a different system. So
Well, I'll get to that in a second. That relates to the storage of it. You had some concerns. Mr. Morrison articulated his concerns about if the transcript was leaked out. And I think both you and Mr. Morrison agreed that it needed to be protected.
Just a correction. I don't think it was Mr. Morrison. It was Mr. Eisenberg, right?
Mr. Morrison testified at his deposition.
Okay, we don't have that in front of us. If you can give us that, we'll take a look.
yeah, I think in this, but I could say for myself, there were the concerns about leaks seemed valid, and I wasn't particularly critical. I thought this was sensitive and was not going to question the attorney's judgment on that.
Right. And even on the code word server, you had access to it.
Yes.
So at no point in time during the course of your official duties were you denied access to this information?
Correct.
Is that correct? Ms. Williams, I want to turn to you for a moment. And you testified that you believe the transcript is complete and accurate, other than the one issue you mentioned?
Yes, substantively accurate, yes.
Now, did you express any concerns to anyone in your office about what you heard on the call?
My supervisor was listening on the call as well. So because he had heard the same information, I did not feel a need to have a further conversation with him about it.
And you never had any concerns with anyone else in the Vice President's office?
I did not discuss the call further with anyone in the Vice President's office.
Okay, so you didn't flag it for the Chief of Staff or the Vice President's counsel or anyone of that sort?
Again, my immediate supervisor, Lieutenant General Kellogg, was in the room with me.
Right.
So.
And after the call, did you and General Kellogg ever discuss the contents of the call?
We did not, no.
Okay. Now, in the run-up to the meeting in Warsaw, the Vice President was meeting with President Zelensky September 1st in Warsaw. You were involved with the preparation of the Vice President's briefing materials?
I was.
And did you flag for the Vice President this parts of the call that had concerned you?
No, we did not include the call transcript in the trip briefing book. We don't normally include previous calls in trip briefing books.
So I'm just wondering if the concerns were so significant, how come nobody on the Vice President's staff at least alerted him to the issue that President Zelensky might be on edge about something that had been mentioned on the 725 call? Again,
my supervisor had been in the call with me, and I ensured that the Vice President had access to the transcript in the moment on that day. As we were preparing for the September meeting with President Zelensky, the more immediate issue at hand was 2 days prior, the news had broken about the hold on the security assistance. So we were much more focused on the discussion that was likely to occur about the hold on security assistance for that meeting.
And to your recollection, you were in the meeting with President Zelensky and Vice President Pence?
I was.
And Burisma didn't come up, or the Bidens, or
No.
any of these investigations?
No, I did not.
Colonel Vindman, you testified that the president has long-standing concerns about corruption in Ukraine, correct?
I don't recall, but there are concerns. There are broad concerns about corruption, yes.
But you would agree that if the U.S. is giving hundreds of millions of dollars to a foreign nation that has a corruption problem, that's certainly something that the U.S. government officials and the president would want to be concerned about?
Yes.
And if a foreign country has a problem with oligarchs taking money, taking U.S. taxpayer dollars, that's something that the president ought to be concerned about in advance of dispensing the aid?
Yes.
And I believe you did testify that corruption is endemic in Ukraine?
Correct.
Are you also aware of the president's skepticism of foreign aid generally?
I am.
And it's something that he's made part of his priorities to make sure that U.S. foreign aid is spent wisely?
That is correct.
And you're also aware the president has concerns about burden sharing among our allies?
Yes.
And with respect to Ukraine, he was very interested and engaged in seeing if there was a possibility for our European allies to step up and contribute more?
Yes, I think that would be in the context of military assistance. In terms of burden sharing, the European Union provides over $15 billion.
Okay.
Has provided since 2014.
Okay, but you are aware of the president's concern of burden sharing, right?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Turning our attention specifically to the company of Burisma. Mykola Zlochevsky, the co-founder of Burisma, it's one of Ukraine's largest natural gas producers, correct?
That is my understanding, yes.
And it's been subject to numerous investigations over the years.
I'm not aware of, I guess I couldn't point to specific investigations, but there is what I would call a pattern of questionable dealings and questions about corruption.
Zlochevsky had served as the Minister of Ecology during President Yanukovych's tenure?
I came to learn that is correct, yes.
And are you aware, and George Kent testified a little bit about this last week, that under the Obama administration, the U.S. government encouraged Ukraine to investigate whether Zlochevsky used his government position to grant himself or Burisma exploration licenses? Are you aware of that?
I would defer to George Kent. He's a fount of knowledge on Ukraine, much deeper knowledge than I have. And if he attested to that, then I'd take his word for it.
And he testified that the U.S., along with the United Kingdom, was engaged in trying to recoup about $23 million in taxpayer dollars from Zlochevsky and the Burisma entity?
I understand he testified that, yes.
Okay. And Mr. Kent also testified that the investigation was moving along, and then all of a sudden there was a bribe paid, and the investigation went away. Did you hear him mention that?
I heard him mention that. These are events that occurred before my time, so frankly, beyond what he said, I don't know much more.
Fair enough. Right around the time the bribe was paid, the company sought to bolster their board. Are you aware that they tapped some luminaries for their corporate board?
Certainly, I learned that at some point, yes.
Including the president of Poland, I believe?
Yes.
And Hunter Biden?
Yes, I came to learn that as well.
And are you aware of any specific experience Hunter Biden has in the Ukrainian corporate governance world?
I don't know much about Mr. Hunter Biden.
And we talked a little bit about, at your deposition, about whether Mr. Biden was qualified to serve on this board. And you know, I believe you acknowledged that apparently he was not, in fact, qualified?
As far as I can tell, he didn't seem to be, but like I said, I don't know his qualifications.
Okay. Ms. Williams, I want to turn our attention to the inaugural trip. At one point, the Vice President and the Vice President's office was focusing on attending that, correct?
That's right.
And it's somewhat complicated because, as I understand it, the White House doesn't want the President and the Vice President to be out of the country at the same time?
Yes, that's correct.
And during the time frame, the President was in Japan. I believe he was in Japan May 24th to 28th. And then he returned to Europe for the D-Day ceremonies, June 2nd to 7th. And I think you told us that there was a window you provided of 4 days at the end of May, that if the Vice President was going to attend the inauguration, it had to be the 29th, 30th, 31st, or 1st?
Our embassy in Kyiv had been in discussions with the Ukrainian, with President Zelensky's team. And as we had learned, obviously, the Ukrainian parliament was not going to come back into session until mid-May. And so we wouldn't know formally what the date would be. But we understood that the initial thinking was that they were looking at dates at the end of May. And so honing in on that time frame, we were aware of President Trump's planned travel on either end. And so that's why we advised the Ukrainians that if Vice President Pence were to be able to participate, the only really available days would be May 30th, May 31st, or June 1st.
Okay. And before the Vice President travels to a foreign nation, you have to send the Secret Service, do advance work, book hotels, and it's a relatively involved preparation experience, right?
That's correct.
And do you know if the Secret Service ever deployed, booked hotels or anything of that sort?
My understanding is that our advance team was looking into those preparations, including hotel availability, and we were trying to determine when it would be appropriate to send out Secret Service and other advanced personnel in order to lay groundwork for a trip. But because we weren't sure yet when the date would be, we hesitated to send those officials out.
But ultimately, the Secret Service, as I understand it, did not deploy.
I don't believe they did, no.
Okay. And the President Zelensky's inauguration was May 20th, if I'm not mistaken?
Yes, that's correct.
And you had about 4 days' notice?
In the end, the Ukrainian parliament decided on May 16th to set the date for May 20th. That's correct.
So you would acknowledge that that made it quite difficult for the Vice President and the whole operation to mobilize and get over to Ukraine, correct?
It would have been, but we had already stopped the trip planning by that point.
And when did that happen?
Stopping the trip planning?
Yeah.
On May 13th.
Okay. And how did you hear about that?
I was called by a colleague in the Vice President's Chief of Staff's office and told to stop the trip planning.
Okay. And as I understand it, it was the assistant to the Chief of Staff?
That's correct.
Okay. And so you didn't hear about it from General Kellogg or the Chief of Staff or?
Correct.
Or the President or the Vice President? You heard about it from Mr. Short's assistant?
That's right.
And did you have any knowledge of the reasoning for stopping the trip?
I asked my colleague why we should stop trip planning and why the Vice President would not be attending, and I was informed that the President had decided the Vice President would not attend the inauguration.
Okay. But do you know why the President decided?
No, she did not have that information.
Okay. And ultimately, the Vice President went to Canada for a USMCA event.
That's right.
During this this window of time, correct?
Correct.
So it's entirely conceivable that the President decided that he wanted the Vice President to go to Canada on behalf of USMCA instead of doing anything else, correct?
I'm really not in a position to speculate what the motivations were behind the President's decision.
Well, you know the Vice President's done quite a bit of USMCA events, correct?
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Okay. And are you aware of whether anyone at the State Department inquired with your office about the Vice President's availability for the trip to Canada?
For the trip, at what point?
Early May, maybe May 8th.
I was not involved in the trip planning for Canada. Mm-hmm. One of my colleagues who covers Western Hemisphere was in charge of that, so I'm not aware of specific requests about the Vice President's availability. I was aware from my colleague who was planning that trip that we had competing trips potentially for the same window, but I was told that the Ukraine trip would take priority.
Okay, but ultimately you don't know.
I don't know about the Canada trip?
You don't know the reason as to why the Vice President was sent to Canada for a USMCA event instead of going to the Ukraine?
I would say I don't know the reason behind why the President directed the Vice President not to go to Ukraine. I can't speak to the motivations or about the Canada trip.
Okay. Colonel Vindman, I'd like to turn a little bit to the July 10th meeting in Ambassador Bolton's office and the subsequent post-meeting in the wardroom. Who all was in the July 10th meeting, to the best of your recollection?
Are we talking about the boardroom, or are we talking about the actual meeting with Ambassador Bolton?
We'll start with the first meeting in the ambassador's office.
So from the U.S. side, we had Ambassador Bolton, Dr. Hill. I believe there was another a special assistant to the president, Wells Griffith, was in there. Mm-hmm. And myself from the Ukrainians.
Who from the Ukrainians? Oh, sorry.
For the Ukrainian side, we had Alexander Danyaluk, Andriy Yermak, and I think Alexander Danyaluk's advisor, Alexei Semeny.
Okay. And you testified that you couldn't recall exactly why Ambassador Bolton stopped the meeting short, and you only learned it subsequently talking to Dr. Fiona Hill?
Yeah, I noted that, it ended abruptly, but I didn't, frankly, I didn't exactly know why.
And in the Bolton meeting, you don't remember Ambassador Sondland using the word Biden?
He did not.
Okay.
To the best of my recollection, I don't think he did.
And then the group decamped to take a photo, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So the general feeling of the group was a positive one at that time, even though it may have ended abruptly.
I think Ambassador Bolton was exceptionally qualified. He understood the strategic communications opportunity of having a photo, and we prompted him to before we completely adjourned to see if he was willing to do a photo, and he did.
Okay, so you went out to West Executive Ave or wherever in the White House and you took a photo. I think you said you took it?
I certainly took a couple of them, yes.
Okay. And in the photo was Secretary Perry, Ambassador Bolton, Ambassador Volker,
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Mr. Daniluk, and Mr. Yarmark?
Yes, and I apologize. When I was running through the U.S. side, of course, Ambassador Bolton, Volker, and Sondland were there, and Secretary Perry was there.
Okay. Now, you testified that before the July 10th meeting, you had developed concerns about the narrative, involving Rudy Giuliani. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And had you heard like a firsthand account from anyone on the inside, or had you just been following news accounts?
So I certainly was following news accounts, and that's from the Ukrainian side, Ukrainian press, and U.S. press.
Okay.
And my colleagues in the interagency also were concerned about this, as this had started in the March timeframe, kind of emanating from the John Solomon story all the way through. So there have been ongoing conversations, so several different sources, Council.
Okay. And so when Ambassador Sondland mentioned the investigations, you sort of had a little bit of a clue of what the issue was?
Oh, definitely.
Okay. And then you took the photo, very nice photo, and then you went to the wardroom?
Correct.
And do you remember, I think you conceded to us that you had a hard time remembering exactly what was said in the wardroom. Again, it's 4 months ago. It's hard to be precise about whether Sondland, what specific words he used, whether he used Burisma, 2016 investigations.
Yeah, so I believe it's in the deposition, the three elements, Burisma, Biden's, and the 2016 elections were all mentioned.
In the wardroom?
Correct.
I think we can maybe go back to this, but I think on page 64 of your testimony, you told us that you don't remember him using 2016 in the wardroom.
I believe that I actually followed up, and because this question was asked multiple times, I said that all three elements were in there. So
okay, so
picked out
when we asked the question, it sort of refreshed your recollection.
Yes, I guess that's a term now.
There was some discussion of, whether when Mr. Morrison took over the portfolio for Dr. Hill, whether you were sidelined at all. Did you feel like you were?
So I certainly was excluded or didn't participate in the trip to Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus at the end of August. And I wasn't initially, before it changed from a POTUS trip to a vice president trip to Warsaw, I wasn't participating in that one. So I didn't miss that, no.
Okay. Did you express any concerns to Mr. Morrison about why you weren't included on those trips?
So Mr. Morrison, I was on leave. I was supposed to be on leave from the 3rd of August through about the 16th or so of August, and he called me and asked me to return. There was obviously high priority travel to the region. He needed my assistance to help plan for it, and in asking me to return early from leave, which I take infrequently, I assumed that I'd be going on the trip. So when I was, after returning from leave early, when I was told I wasn't going, I inquired about it, correct.
Okay. And what feedback did he give you?
He initially told me that the aircraft that was acquired, the Mil Air, was too small and there wasn't enough room.
Had you ever had any discussions with Mr. Morrison about concerns that he or Dr. Hill had with your judgment?
Did I ever have any conversations with Mr. Morrison about it? No.
Okay. Did Mr. Morrison ever express concerns to you that he thought maybe you weren't following the chain of command in all instances?
He did not.
Did Dr. Hill or Mr. Morrison ever ask you questions about whether you were trying to access information outside of your lane?
They did not.
Another, aspect of the Ukraine portfolio that you were not a part of were some of the communications Mr. Morrison was having with Ambassador Taylor.
Correct.
And did you ever express concern that he was leaving you off those calls?
Well, certainly it was concerning. He had just come on board. He didn't have the, he wasn't steeped in all the items that we were working on, including the policy that we had developed over the preceding months. And I thought I could contribute to that, to the performance of his duties.
Okay. When you went to Ukraine for the inauguration?
Correct.
May 20th. At any point during that trip, did Mr. Daniluk offer you a position of defense minister with the Ukrainian government?
He did.
And how many times did he do that?
I believe it was 3 times.
And do you have any reason why he asked you to do that?
I don't know, but every single time I dismissed it. Upon returning, I notified my chain of command and the appropriate counterintelligence folks about the offer.
I mean, Ukraine's a country that's experienced a war with Russia. Certainly their Minister of Defense is a pretty key position for the Ukrainians. President Zelensky, Mr. Daniluk, to bestow that honor on you, at least asking you. I mean, that was a big honor, correct?
I think it would be a great honor, and frankly, I'm aware of service members that have left service to help nurture the developing democracies in that part of the world, certainly in the Baltics. Former officers, and if I recall correctly, it was an Air Force officer that became Minister of Defense. But I'm an American. I came here when I was a toddler, and I immediately dismissed these offers, did not entertain them.
When he made this offer to you initially, did you leave the door open? Was there a reason that he had to come back and ask a second and third time, or was he just trying to convince you?
Counsel, you know what? It's the whole notion is rather comical that I was being asked to consider whether I'd want to be the Minister of Defense. I did not leave the door open at all.
Okay.
But it is pretty funny for a Lieutenant Colonel of the United States Army, which really is not that senior, to be offered that illustrious a position.
When he made this offer to you, was he speaking in English or Ukrainian?
Oh, Mr. Daniluk is a absolutely flawless English speaker who's speaking in English.
Okay.
And just to be clear, there were 2 other staff officers, Embassy Kiev staff officers, that were sitting next to me when this offer was made.
Okay. Yeah. And who were they?
So one of them you may have met. It was Mr. David Holmes, and the other one was, I don't know. I mean, I guess it's another Foreign Service officer, Keith Bean.
Okay. Yeah, we met Mr. Holmes last Friday evening.
I understand. Yeah. He's a delightful fellow.
And you said when you returned to the United States, you papered it up, given your with SCI clearance. Whenever a foreign government makes an overture like that, you paper it up and you tell your chain of command?
I did, but I also don't know if I fully entertained it as a legitimate offer. I was just making sure that I did the right thing in terms of reporting, yes.
Okay. And did any of your supervisors, Dr. Hill at the time, or Dr. Kupperman or Ambassador Bolton ever follow up with you about that? It's rather significant.
Yeah.
The Ukrainians offered you the post of defense minister. Did you tell anyone in your chain of command about it?
After I spoke to, and I believe the deputy, our deputy senior director, John Areth, was there. Once I mentioned it to both of them, I don't believe there was ever a follow-up discussion.
Okay. So it never came up with Dr. Kupperman or Dr. Hill?
following that conversation I had with Dr. Hill, I don't believe there was a subsequent conversation, and I don't recall ever having a conversation with Dr. Kupperman about it.
Okay, and did you brief Director Morrison when he came on board?
No, I completely forgot about it.
Okay. And subsequent to the May trip, did Mr. Danny Luke ever ask you to reconsider? Were there any other offers?
No.
When he visited for the July 10th meeting with Ambassador Bolton, did it come up again?
It never came up again.
Okay. And did you ever think that possibly if this information was, got out, that it might create at least the perception of a conflict, that the Ukrainians thought so highly of you to offer you the defense ministry post, on one hand, but on the other hand, you're responsible for Ukrainian policy at the National Security Council?
So, frankly, it's more important about what my American leadership, my American chain of command thinks than any of the, and this is, these are honorable people. I'm not sure if he meant it as a joke or not, but it's much more important what my civilian White House National Security Council chain of command thinks, more so than anybody else. And frankly, if they were concerned about me being able to continue my duties,
Of course.
they would have brought that to my attention. Dr. Hill stayed on for several more months, and we could continue to work to advance U.S. policy.
Okay. And during the times relevant of the committee's investigation, did you have any communications with Mr. Yarmouk or Danny Luke outside of the July 10th meeting?
I recall a courtesy note from Mr. Yarmouk within days of his return to July, in which he wanted to preserve an open channel communication, and I said, please feel free to contact me with any concerns.
And were you following this? There's sort of two tracks. Ambassador Taylor walked us through it during his testimony last Wednesday. He called it a regular channel, and then he called it an irregular but not outlandish channel with Ambassador Sondland and Ambassador Volker. Were you tracking the Sondland and Volker channel during this time period?
Yeah, so I'm trying to recall at which point I became aware of Ambassador. Certainly, I was aware of the fact that they were working together. Ambassador Sondland, Ambassador Volker, and Secretary Perry were working together to advance U.S. policy interests that were in support of what had been agreed to. But I didn't really learn, like I said, until the July 10th. Actually, there may have been a slightly earlier point. I recall a meeting in which Ambassador Bolton facilitated a meeting between Ambassador Volker and Ambassador Bolton in the June timeframe. And there may have been some discussion about this external channel, but
okay.
I frankly didn't become aware of these particular U.S. government officials being involved in this alternate track until July 10th.
Okay, and I think we had some discussion that Mr. Giuliani was promoting a negative narrative about the Ukraine, and certain officials were trying to help the president understand that with Zelensky, it was a new day, and Ukraine's going to be different. Is that your understanding?
That is correct. That is exactly what was being reported by the intelligence community, by the policy channels within the NSC, and the conservative voices of the various people that have actually met with him, including foreign officials.
And to the extent that you're aware of what Ambassador Sondland's goals were here and Ambassador Volker's goals were here, you think they were just trying to do the best they could and try to advocate in the best interest of the United States?
That is what I believed, and that is what I still believe, frankly.
And so to the extent Mr. Giuliani may have had differing views, they were trying to help him understand that it was time to change those views?
I think they were trying to bring him into the tent and have him kind of support the direction that we had settled on.
And you never conferred with Mr. Giuliani?
No.
You never had any meetings, phone calls, or anything of that sort?
I did not.
And did you have any?
I only know him as New York's finest mayor.
America's mayor.
America's mayor.
And did you have any discussions, communications during this relevant time period with the president?
I've never had any contact with the president of the United States.
My time's expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. We're going to now move to the 5-minute member rounds. Are you good to go forward, or do you need a break?
I think we'll elect to take a short break.
Okay, let's try to take a 5 or 10 minute break, and we will resume with the 5-minute rounds.
So there you have it.
If I could ask.
First round of
the
questioning
audience
for
and
the two
members to
witnesses
please
today,
allow
Jennifer
witnesses
Williams,
to
Special Advisor to Vice President Mike Pence, Russia expert for Vice President Mike Pence, also Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vidman, who is the top Ukrainian expert on the National Security Council. A lot of focus, of course, on the July 25th phone call between President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky. Jennifer Williams describing it as unusual. Colonel Vidman saying that he was troubled by it. That's why he reported it to the White House, to the National Security Council lawyer John Eisenberg, the White House counsel who's dealing with national security issues. Also focus on the vice president's communications with the Ukrainians, including the question of why his first visit to the inauguration of President Zelensky was canceled by President Trump, and his September 18th phone call where he told the Ukrainian president that the aid that had been held up would be freed. And of course, a lot of focus as well on a July 10th meeting between the Ukrainians and White House officials, where Ambassador Sondland, who's going to be a key witness tomorrow, was communicated with the Ukrainians that they would have to pursue these investigations, political investigations, in order to get the aid lifted. A lot to talk about here. I want to bring in our senior congressional correspondent, Mary Bruce, and you had both witnesses who, of course, both still serve in the White House, talking about that July 25th phone call, and Colonel Vidman saying that he interpreted the president's request to President Zelensky at that time to do him a favor on those investigations as a demand.
Yeah, George, it is amazing that we are now hearing for the first time from people who are actually on that phone call, who were listening in. And you saw them both outline why it is that they had such concerns about what they overheard on the phone call. Lieutenant Colonel Vidman making it clear that he felt that it was not proper for the president to be pushing for Ukraine to launch these investigations into the Bidens, and explaining why he went ahead and relayed that information, why he reported what he heard to his superior. What stood out to me, George, is also this question of corruption. We have seen over the last several weeks that Republicans have been making the argument that the president on that phone call, on that July 25th phone call and the one that preceded it, that he was pushing for these investigations simply because he wanted to root out corruption at large, and he was pushing a legitimate concern about trying to deal with corruption in Ukraine. Colonel Vidman testified that even though it was on the talking points that he gave to the president for that call, that corruption was never mentioned by the president. And that is what we've seen in the actual transcripts that were released by the White House. On the flip side, George, Democrats will also note that there are some theories that they were pushing here that Republicans will likely see as a positive for them. Colonel Vidman noting that while there were some omissions from the White House transcript, he says he doesn't think those were a very big deal, and that is probably good news for Republicans.
That was the omission of the word Burisma from that. Of course, that is the company that Hunter Biden went and worked for. John Carl, you saw Chairman Nunes on the Republican side spend a lot of time on the whistleblower and the committee's failure to call in the whistleblower. Not too much time in the questioning, although there were some suggestions at the end of Mr. Castor's questioning that perhaps Colonel Vidman's superiors had some questions about his judgment. But a real difference between how the Republicans were approaching this on the committee so far and what you're seeing from the Trump campaign as Colonel Vidman testifies.
Yeah, there's a real dichotomy here, George. On the one hand, what you described, we're hearing from Republicans on the committee not really going after Vidman's credibility. The White House has been putting out talking points, rapid response as this hearing has gone on. They largely have not gone very hard at Vidman's credibility, but instead talking about specific aspects of his testimony. But the Trump campaign is going right at him and going at him hard. The Trump campaign war room has tweeted just as he was getting started, Alexander Vidman is an unelected bureaucrat who was upset that President Trump was leading foreign policy instead of sticking to Vidman's talking points. So they are going after him in a personal way. But the White House is focusing on some specific aspects of it. What Mary mentioned in terms of the transcript being accurate. Another important point is that this question of whether or not the transcript was inappropriately put on a super secure server to try to hide it. Vidman was asked about that, and he didn't see any problem with how the transcript was stored, and pointed out even when it was on that super secure server, he himself had access to it.
Cecilia Vega also at the White House today, and Cecilia, interesting, so far at least, no tweets that I've seen from President Trump.
We were just talking about that here, George. So far, nothing yet. We do expect to hear from the president in actually just a few minutes from now. He's going to allow the press back into a cabinet meeting that he's hearing. You can see the activity for reporters getting ready to go in here behind me. But you remember, it was last week that the president's own tweet about Marie Yovanovitch that really blew up the main Republican argument, and they're attempting to not attack credibility. So if and when that happens again, this will completely fly in the face of what the Republicans are out there trying to do today to not attack the credibility of those witnesses they're testifying.
Okay, thank you. Let's come back to the table here right now. David Miram struck again by both Jennifer Williams and especially Colonel Vindman in his opening statement, emphasizing their service, emphasizing their years of service. Colonel Vindman emphasizing patriotism with that direct communication with his dad in the testimony.
Speaking directly to his dad, the decision for that family to come when he was just a young boy, saying, you would be proud of me being here today because we're in a country where speaking out is allowed in a democracy. But to go back to the 2 points that you just made there, George, about what the lieutenant colonel, and we all saw there today how important his rank is to him, that you use it correctly from that committee. Not only did he point out that there was no mention of corruption, you heard John Carl say that the war room is saying the president didn't follow his talking points, that's why he's upset. But it also flies in the face of the fact that Republicans have said for some time now the president was simply trying to root out corruption, and it wasn't on either call. And the second thing he went into in great detail, George, was that July 10th meeting, Ambassador Sondland there, as we all know, when that abruptly ended because of Mr. Bolton, actually, National Security Advisor, who stopped the meeting short. There was that second meeting where Ambassador Sondland, he said directly to him, possibly in questioning, he said in front of some Ukrainians that were still there, that this was inappropriate, this request, and that it has nothing to do with national security, which puts even a greater focus on Sondland come tomorrow.
And Sondland tomorrow, and Dan Abrams also, as you're watching this testimony, you keep coming back to the voices we're not hearing in these hearings. John Bolton, Mick Mulvaney, Rudy Giuliani.
Yeah, well, look, and if the Republicans want the people with the most direct evidence of that, they'll have Giuliani come forward. They'll have Pompeo come forward. And the president suggesting that maybe he'll even testify. Of course, no one's really taking that seriously. But what I found really interesting in the Republicans' questions is they're trying to make statements through questions. They're trying to alert the public to issues by asking questions.
That's their job, by the way.
That is, no, absolutely. Yeah. And so you see it both on the part of Nunes and Castor asking questions about leaks, suggesting that maybe Vindman was frustrated, that he wasn't in the loop on this stuff, and most importantly, questioning his loyalty. And I think that's one of the biggest subtle attacks we're seeing from Castor. All these questions about this offer of getting the defense ministry position, that they offered it to him, and he seems to be almost laughing it off. It was comical. But Castor not taking it as a joke, going back again and again. Were you concerned about any possible conflict? And he seems almost unable to answer the question because he's saying, look, I reported it, and then I kind of forgot about it. And Castor coming back to it again and again, which I think they're hoping is going to resonate with people that say, was this guy first and foremost devoted to the United States or to Ukraine?
Yeah, it seemed Martha Raddatz, that Colonel Vindman didn't know whether to be offended or amused.
And you couldn't tell. You know, we should go back to the very beginning of his testimony, too, where he was clearly very nervous. It's very strange to see
his hand shaking.
His hand was shaking, holding his statement. A combat-tested veteran, nervous in front of this committee. But I do think that pointing to the loyalty. I mean, remember, his family immigrated from Ukraine when it was still part of the Soviet Union. He speaks, as a little humor today, he said he speaks Ukrainian, Russian, and a little bit of English. But I also think Nunes, one of the things he is doing is saying, look, the diplomats we had last week disliked Trump's policy. And that's, I think, what they're trying to do with Vindman, especially. You are operating outside this. But what Vindman says again and again is it was these disruptive actors like Giuliani who were promoting false information that undermined the U.S.-Ukraine policy. He's trying to say he was following the policy, and Giuliani and others
were the ones outside of it.
Outside of it.
So many of the questions were around the question, as we've been talking about, the issue of corruption and whether or not the president was pursuing corruption, and whether or not the questioning about Burisma and the 2016 campaign was truly about corruption. And the Democratic counsel, Dan Goldman, got into that in his questioning of Vindman. Let's take a look at that.
So it is a part of U.S. official policy that Ukraine should root out corruption, even if President Trump did not mention it in that April 21st phone call. Is that right?
Certainly.
And he also did not mention it in the July 25th phone call. Is that right?
Correct.
So even though it was included in his talking points for the April 21st call, and presumably even though you can't talk about it for the July 21st call, it was not included in either. Is that right?
For the April 21st call.
He did not mention it in either, rather.
Correct.
So when the president says now that he held up security assistance because he was concerned about rooting out corruption in Ukraine, that concern was not expressed in the 2 phone conversations that he had with President Zelensky earlier this year. Is that right?
Correct.
So Chris Christie, what we have at issue here, if the Republicans can demonstrate that the president was sincerely pursuing corruption, then he's doing his job. If the Democrats can demonstrate, no, he wasn't really pursuing corruption, he was doing these political investigations that had nothing to do with corruption, it's an abuse of power.
Well, the first thing that I'm sure every American is shocked by is to hear that Donald Trump wasn't following talking points. Incredibly shocking that he was, not following what the others told him to do. And I think when you look at that 25th call, I would disagree a little bit with that because he talked about CrowdStrike. Now, people will say, there's no validity to that.
Anyway, you actually saw the question of Colonel Vindman and other witnesses last week about
They totally disagree with it, but I would be willing to bet you that if the president were asked directly, what he would say in response is, the things I was talking about there were about corruption. And so I didn't read it like the talking point was put out. That's what the Republican argument's going to be.
I think you're exactly right, but this is where you get into the question of is ignorance a defense? I guess because we now know from Tom Bossert, an ABC contributor who's the president's Homeland Security director, that from the beginning of the administration, he and others were consistently telling the president, this is a conspiracy theory. This has been debunked. It's not true.
Right, but you had others who he listens to,
Rudy Giuliani.
like Rudy Giuliani and others that Giuliani was associating with, who were telling him the opposite. And so, the fact is the president might say, well, yeah, sure, some of these guys were telling me this wasn't true, but other people were telling me it was. So my only point on it is not to get to the efficacy of those charges, but to say that it's not completely accurate, in my view, to say that there was no mention of corruption on there. There might be people who disagree with it. But the president would probably say, that's what I was talking about in the words that are there. That's what I was trying to get to. And I didn't say it artfully, but that's what I was trying to get to with Zelensky.
Melissa Maria, would that be the Republicans' strongest defense if indeed they could demonstrate that the president was legitimately pursuing corruption?
I think this is exactly what they've been trying to do in all of the testimony. None of these witnesses can actually attest to what was in the president's mind. They were there at the call, but they don't know what he's thinking. And this is what all of this testimony is designed to elicit. What is he thinking? You actually don't know, and therefore you're not in a position to speculate, and we're not in a position to take you at your word.
And Terry Moran, your impression overall of the 2 witnesses, particularly Colonel Vindman, do you think that this coded questioning from Castor was effective?
Well, I don't think it necessarily has to be a questioning of the man's loyalty. It is a very unusual circumstance to be offered the Secretary of Defense of a foreign country 3 times. I don't think that you have to question the man's loyalty, but perhaps his vision of policy. Here he also, as a junior staff member on the National Security Council, took it upon himself to coach the president of a foreign country before calling a conversation with the President of the United States. Does he have a vision of policy that the United States has that differs from the President of the United States? That's what the Republicans are trying to get at. But I think the real virtue for a lot of people of Vindman's testimony and of Jennifer Williams is to take us inside a White House policy process that was freaking out about this call. President Trump keeps saying it was a perfect call, a perfect call. Well, everybody around him, when it was brought up, when the subject of investigating Burisma and the Biden was brought up, thought it was really bad. There were meetings that were stopped. There were notes that were written. There were lawyers that were talked to. A lot of people at the White House, inside the White House, when this was going on, thought it was wrong.
I think that's exactly right. It was interesting, though, Terry, that Colonel Vindman did not completely want to validate the Democrats, some of the Democrats' talking points about that call, particularly when he talked about the omission of the word Burisma from the rough transcript of the call.
That's right, and the fact that the call was stored in a server for more classified material. He said those didn't seem to be anything more than bureaucratic rearrangements of the call. But the substance, he thought was inappropriate, his superiors thought was inappropriate, people in the vice president's office thought was inappropriate, White House lawyers thought it was inappropriate. President Trump's telling the American people it was a perfect call, and I think he's doing that because if he acknowledges what 70% of the American public say in our poll, that call was wrong, the question becomes how wrong? Wrong enough to impeach? Wrong enough to remove from office? Wrong enough to censure? He can't afford anything but a perfect call. But the people in the White House participating in it, many of them thought it was wrong.
And Pierre Thomas, Chief Justice Correspondent, reminded again as we focus on this call that the president did try to enlist not only his personal attorney in this effort, but at least in that July 25th phone call with President Zelensky, the Attorney General.
He did indeed. He mentioned the Attorney General 5 separate times. We know from our sourcing that the Attorney General was not happy that he was invoked in that way. And George, the other thing that struck me about the testimony today is that these career officials are portraying their concern about the president's actions, portraying their concern about what Sondland was up to in terms of pressing for these investigations, and the fact that Rudy Giuliani and these two men that he's associated with, Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman, who have been indicted in the Southern District of New York, were basically behind the scenes helping to orchestrate this policy.
Pierre Thomas, thanks. The witnesses have taken their seats. Let's go back to the hearing room.
Committee will come back to order. We'll now begin a period of 5-minute questions from the members. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to ask you both about some of the questions you were asked by my colleagues in the minority. First, if I could ask you, Ms. Williams and Colonel Vindman, you were asked a series of questions by the ranking member at the outset. Were you aware of the fact that, and then there was a recitation of information about Burisma, Zlochevsky, the Bidens. Is it fair to say you have no firsthand knowledge of any of the matters that were asked in those questions?
That's correct.
That is correct.
Ms. Williams, you were also asked a series of questions about the vice president's schedule and whether he could have made the inauguration, or was the president traveling, or the trip to Canada. But let's be clear about something. The president, you were instructed that the president had told the vice president not to go before you even knew the date of the inauguration. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So at the time he was told not to go, there was no calculation about where he might be or where the president might be because the date hadn't even been set yet. Is that right?
That's right. The date had not been set, so we were weighing a number of different scenarios of when the inauguration might fall.
Now, I think you said that originally the president had told him to go, and then you received the instruction that the president no longer wanted him to go. Were you aware in the interim between the president telling him to go and the president telling him not to go that Rudy Giuliani had to abort a trip that he was going to make to Ukraine?
I had seen that in the press, yes.
And had you seen in the press that Rudy Giuliani blamed people around Zelensky for having to cancel the trip?
For having to cancel his trip?
Yes.
I had read that in the press reporting, yes.
And did you read in the press reporting also that Giuliani wanted to go to Ukraine to, as he put it, not meddle in an election, but meddle in investigations?
I did read that, yes.
And that occurred prior to the president canceling the vice president's trip to the inauguration?
It did. I believe it was around May 10th or so.
Colonel Vindman, you were asked by the Minority Counsel about the president's words in the July 25th call and whether the president's words were ambiguous. Was there any ambiguity about the president's use of the word Biden?
There was not.
It was pretty clear that the president wanted Zelensky to commit to investigating the Bidens, was it not?
That is correct.
That is one of the favors that you thought should be properly characterized as a demand?
That is correct.
And there's no ambiguity about that?
In my mind, there was not.
It's also true, is it not, that these two investigations that the president asked Zelensky for into 2016 and into the Bidens were precisely the two investigations that Rudy Giuliani was calling for publicly, were they not?
That is correct.
So when people suggest, well, maybe Rudy Giuliani was acting on his own and maybe he was a freelancer or whatever, the president referred to exactly the same two investigations Rudy Giuliani was out pushing on his behalf. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, Ms. Williams, you were asked about the meeting the vice president had with Zelensky in September, in which the Ukrainians brought up their concern about the hold on the security assistance. Is that right?
That's right.
And you were asked about whether in that meeting between the vice president and Zelensky, the Bidens or Burisma came up, and I think you said they did not, correct?
That's correct. They did not come up.
Now, that bilateral meeting was a large meeting that involved 2 or 3 dozen people, wasn't it?
It was.
So in the context of this meeting with 2 or 3 dozen people, the vice president didn't bring up those investigations, correct?
No, he did not bring up those investigations. He's never brought up those investigations.
Were you aware that immediately, and I mean immediately after that meeting broke up, Ambassador Sondland has said that he went over to Mr. Yermak, one of the top advisors to Zelensky, and told Yermak that if they wanted the military aid, they were going to have to do these investigations, or words to that effect?
I was not aware at the time of any meetings, side meetings that Ambassador Sondland had following the vice president's meeting with President Zelensky. I've only learned that through Ambassador Sondland's testimony.
So at the big public meeting, it didn't come up, and you can't speak to the private meeting that was held immediately thereafter?
Correct. The vice president moved on with his schedule immediately after his meeting with President Zelensky.
Now, Colonel Vindman, I want to go back to that July 10th meeting or meetings, the one with Ambassador Bolton and then the one in the wardroom that followed quickly on its heels. Were you aware that Ambassador Bolton instructed your superior, Dr. Hill, to go talk to the lawyers after that meeting?
I learned shortly after she was finished talking to Ambassador Bolton, and after we wrapped up with the wardroom, that she did have a meeting with him, and that's what was expressed.
Now, you thought you should go talk to the lawyers on your own, correct?
That is my recollection, yes.
But Bolton also thought that Dr. Hill should go talk to the lawyers because of his concern over this drug deal that Sondland and Mulvaney were cooking up. Is that right?
That is my understanding.
And in fact, this drug deal, as Bolton called it, involved this conditioning of the White House meeting on these investigations that Sondland brought up. Is that right?
That is my understanding.
And in fact, this same conditioning or the same issue of wanting these political investigations and tying it to the White House meeting, this came up in the July 25th call, did it not, when the president asked for these investigations?
That is correct.
So the very same issue that Bolton said to Hill, go talk to the lawyers, the very same issue that prompted you to go talk to the lawyers, ends up coming up in that call with the president. Is that right?
That is correct.
And it was that conversation that once again led you back to the lawyer's office.
That is correct.
Now I yield to the ranking member.
Parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman, you took 7 minutes, so I assume you're going to give us equal time.
Yes, Mr. Nunes.
Thank you, gentlemen. Lieutenant Colonel Vindelman, before I turn to Mr. Jordan, I asked Ms. Williams about this, about if she had ever accessed without authorization fellow employees' computer system. She answered no to the question. Have you ever accessed anyone's computer system at the NSC without authorization?
Without their knowledge, no.
Knowledge or authorization?
I'm sorry?
Knowledge or authorization. You never accessed someone's computer without their knowledge or authorization?
Correct.
Mr. Jordan.
I thank the ranking member. Colonel, I want to thank you for your service and sacrifice to our great country. This afternoon, your former boss, Mr. Morrison, is going to be sitting right where you're sitting, and he's going to testify. And I want to give you a chance. I think we're bringing you a copy. I want to give you a chance to respond to some of the things Mr. Morrison said in his deposition, page 82 of the transcript from Mr. Morrison. Mr. Morrison said this: I had concerns about Lieutenant Colonel Vindman's judgment. Among the discussions I had with Dr. Hill in the transition was our team, its strength, its weaknesses, and Fiona and others had raised concerns about Alex's judgment. When Mr. Morris was asked by Mr. Castor, did anyone ever bring concerns to you that they believe Colonel Vindman may have leaked something, Mr. Morrison replied, yes. So your boss had concerns about your judgment. Your former boss, Dr. Hill, had concerns about your judgment. Your colleagues had concerns about your judgment, and your colleagues felt that there were times when you leaked information. Any idea why they have those impressions, Colonel Vindman?
Yes, Representative Jordan. I guess I'll start by reading Dr. Hill's own words, as she attested to in my last evaluation that was dated middle of July, right before she left. Alex is a top 1% military officer and the best Army officer I've worked with in my 15 years of government service. He is brilliant, unflappable, and exercises excellent judgment.
So
it was it was exemplary during numerous visits, so forth and so on, but I think you get the idea. Mr. Morrison, yeah, the data that was, let's see, I'm sorry. July 13th. So, Mr. Jordan, I would say that I can't say what why Mr. Morrison questioned my judgment. We had only recently started working together. He wasn't there very long, and we were just trying to figure out our relationship. Maybe it was a different cultures, military culture versus.
And Colonel, you never leaked information?
I never did, never would. That is preposterous that I would do that.
Okay, Colonel, it's interesting. We deposed a lot of people in the bunker in the basement of the Capitol over the last several weeks, but of all those depositions, only 3 of the individuals we deposed were actually on the now somewhat famous July 25th phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky. There was you, the individual sitting beside you, Ms. Williams, and then there, of course, was your boss, Mr. Morrison, who I just read from his deposition. When we asked Ms. Williams, who she spoke to after the call about the call, she was willing to answer our questions, and chairmanship allowed her to answer our questions. When we asked Mr. Morrison, who he spoke to after the call about the call, he was willing to answer our question, and Mr. Chairmanship allowed him to answer our question. But when we asked you, you first told us 3 individuals at the NSC, your brother and the 2 lawyers. And then you said there was a group of other people you communicated with, but you would only give us 1 individual in that group, Secretary Kent. And the chairman would only allow you to give us that name. When we ask you who else you communicated with, you would not tell us. So I want to know first, how many other people are in that group of people you communicated with outside the 4 individuals I just named?
Yes, Mr. Jordan, on call readout, certainly after the first call, there were probably half a dozen or more people that I read out. Those are people with the proper clearance and the need to know. In this case, because of the sensitivity of the call and Mr. Eisenberg told me not to speak to anybody else, I only read out, outside of the NSC, 2 individuals.
2 individuals.
Das Kent and 1 other person.
And you're not willing to tell us who that other individual is?
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
The gentleman suspend. Counsel.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask you to enforce the rule with regard to disclosure with regard to the intelligence officer.
Thank you, counsel. You know, as I indicated before, this committee will not be used to out the whistleblower. That same
Mr. Chairman,
necessity
can you first stop the time so I don't lose the time?
Will persist. You are recognized again, Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Chairman, I don't see how this is outing the whistleblower. The witness has testified in his deposition that he doesn't know who the whistleblower is. You have said, even though no one believes you, you have said you don't know who the whistleblower is. So how is this outing the whistleblower to find out who this individual is?
Jordan, this is your time for questioning. You can use it any way you like, but your question should be addressed to the witness. And your question should not be addressed to trying to out the whistleblower.
Well, okay. Colonel Vindman, There's another thing Mr. Morrison told us in his deposition. He said he was not concerned about the call itself. He said there was nothing illegal or improper on the call, but he was concerned about the call leaking, the contents of the call leaking. He said this, he was concerned how it would play out in Washington's polarized environment, how the contents would be used in Washington's political process. Mr. Morrison was right.
Excuse me, Mr. Jordan, could I get a page?
Page 44. Mr. Morrison was right. The call leaks. The whistleblower goes to Chairman Schiff, staff. Then he runs off to the lawyer, the same lawyer who said in January of 2017 the coup has started against President Trump. The one thing the Democrats they didn't count on was the president releasing the call transcript and letting us all see what he said. They didn't count on that. Transcript shows no linkage. The two individuals on the call have both said no pressure, no pushing, no linkage, but security assistance dollars to an investigation. Ms. Williams, after the call on the 25th, you know that Colonel Vindman talked to several people. After the call on the 25th, how many people did you talk to about the call?
I did not speak to anybody about the call.
Didn't speak to anybody.
No.
I yield back.
Mr. Himes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter the Lieutenant Colonel's performance review into the record.
May I inquire of Colonel Vindman whether you would like us to do that? If you would, we're happy to. If you would prefer it not be in the record, I leave that to you.
Yeah, I guess with redactions, it has PII in it, and that should be protected. And maybe the only elements that are relevant are the actual narrative. Chairman,
did you read the relevant portions, or?
I mean, that was the short version. There were some other paragraphs in there, but
Chairman, I'll withdraw my request.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you both for your testimony. Ms. Williams, you joined the Foreign Service in 2006, correct?
Correct.
Prior to becoming a nonpartisan career official, you worked as a field representative for the Bush-Cheney campaign in 2004, and then you held a political appointment in the Department of Homeland Security under Secretary Chertoff. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
And now as a Foreign Service officer, you have served 3 presidents, 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat in a variety of roles, correct?
Yes, sir.
And in your current position, you're detailed from state to advise the Vice President on foreign policy towards Europe and Russia, correct?
That's right.
Ms. Williams, on Sunday, the President personally targeted you in a tweet. This is after he targeted Ambassador Yovanovitch during her hearing testimony. I'd like to show and read you the tweet. It reads, "Tell Jennifer Williams, whoever that is, to read both transcripts of the presidential calls and see the just-released statement from Ukraine. Then she should meet with the other never-Trumpers, who I don't know and mostly never even heard of, and work out a better presidential attack." Ms. Williams, are you engaged in a presidential attack?
No, sir.
Ms. Williams, are you a never-Trumper?
I'm not sure I know an official definition of a never-Trumper.
Would you describe yourself that way?
I would not, no.
Did that tweet make an impression on you when you read it?
It certainly surprised me. I was not expecting to be called out by name.
It surprised me too, and it looks an awful lot like witness intimidation and tampering in an effort to try to get you to perhaps shape your testimony today. Lieutenant Colonel, you previously testified that you've dedicated your entire professional life to the United States of America. Colonel, above your left breast, you are wearing a device which is a Springfield musket on a blue field. What is that device?
It's a combat infantryman's badge.
How do you get the combat infantryman's badge?
You have to be serving in a brigade and below, a tactical unit. That means a fighting unit, frontline unit, in combat.
Under fire?
Correct.
You're also wearing a Purple Heart. Can you tell us in 20 or 30 seconds why you're wearing a Purple Heart?
In 2014, in the ramp up to probably the largest urban operation in decades outside of Fallujah, we were conducting a reconnaissance patrol in conjunction with the Marines, and my vehicle was struck by an improvised explosive device that penetrated the armor.
Were you injured?
I was.
The day after you appeared for your deposition, Lieutenant Colonel, President Trump called you a never-Trumper. Colonel Vindman, would you call yourself a never-Trumper?
Representative, I'd call myself never partisan.
Thank you. Colonel Vindman, in your military career, you've served under 4 presidents, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. Have you ever wavered from the oath you took to support and defend the Constitution?
Never.
Do you have any political motivations for your appearance here today?
None.
Colonel Vindman, multiple right-wing conspiracy theorists, including Rudy Giuliani, have accused you of harboring loyalty towards Ukraine. They make these accusations based only on the fact that your family, like many American families, immigrated to the United States. They've accused you of espionage and dual loyalties. We've seen that in this room this morning. The 3 minutes that were spent asking you about the offer made to make you the Minister of Defense, that may have come cloaked in a Brooks Brothers suit and in parliamentary language, but that was designed exclusively to give the right-wing media an opening to question your loyalties. And I want people to understand what that was all about. It's the kind of attack, it's the kind of thing you say when you're defending the indefensible. It's what you say when it's not enough to attack the media, the way the ranking member gave over his opening statement, or to attack the Democrats. But it's what you stoop to when the indefensibility of your case requires that you attack a man who is wearing a Springfield rifle on a field of blue above a Purple Heart. I, sir, thank you for your service and yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Conaway.
Madam Chairman, you have 5 minutes to Mr. Ratcliffe.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. In a press conference last Thursday, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi said that President Trump committed the impeachable offense of bribery, evidenced in his July 25th call transcript with President Zelensky. In concert with that, multiple Democratic members of this committee gave TV and radio interviews over this past week discussing how the president's conduct supported his impeachment for committing bribery, all of which struck me as very odd, because for the longest time this was all about quid pro quo, according to the whistleblower complaint. But after witness began saying there was no quid pro quo, or even that quid pro quo was not even possible, we saw a shift from the Democrats. They briefly started to refer to the president's conduct on the July 25th call as extortion. And now it's shifted again last week to bribery. Ms. Williams, you used the word unusual to describe the president's call on July 25th. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, you used the word inappropriate and proper. Now, I've word searched each of your transcripts, and the word bribery or bribe doesn't appear anywhere in that. Ms. Williams, you've never used the word bribery or bribe to explain President Trump's conduct, correct?
No, sir.
Colonel Vindman, you haven't either.
That is correct.
The problem is, in an impeachment inquiry that the Speaker of the House says is all about bribery, where bribery is the impeachable offense, no witness has used the word bribery to describe President Trump's conduct. None of them. These aren't all of the deposition transcripts. These are just the 10 that have been released. 6 weeks of witness interviews in this impeachment inquiry, hundreds of hours of testimony, thousands of questions asked, thousands of answers given. The number of times that witnesses have been asked any question about whether or not President Trump's conduct constituted bribery before Ambassador Yovanovitch was asked by my colleague, Congressman Stewart, last Thursday, is 0. The number of times witnesses have used the word bribery or bribe to describe President Trump's conduct in the last 6 weeks of this inquiry is 0. In fact, in these 3,500 pages of sworn deposition testimony and just these 10 transcripts released thus far, the word bribery appears in these 3,500 pages exactly 1 time. And ironically, it appears not in a description of President Trump's alleged conduct. It appears in a description of Vice President Biden's alleged conduct. This is important because as early as next week, My Democratic colleagues are going to say, we need to vote on the evidence from this impeachment inquiry, on the impeachment of the president for bribery. And they're going to send a report to the Judiciary Committee, and because there's more Democrats than Republicans, it's going to likely pass. And when that happens, the American people need to be clear that when the Democrats, what they are describing as bribery, not a single witness is describing as bribery. We've heard many times in the course of this proceeding that the facts of the president are not in dispute. But the American people are asking, if the facts are the same, why do the crimes that the president is being accused of keep changing? Why do we go from quid pro quo to extortion, now to bribery? Chairman Nunes told you the answer. The answer is polling. Washington Times asked Americans what would be the most damning accusation, and it didn't come back quid pro quo, it didn't come back extortion, it came back bribery. So this case is all about bribery. Look, it's bad enough that the Democrats have forbidden White House lawyers from participating in this proceeding. It's hard enough to defend yourself without your lawyers present. But what's even worse is trying to defend yourself against an accusation that keeps changing in the middle of the proceeding. If Democrats accuse the president of a high crime or impeachable offense, he at least ought to know which one it is. And when Speaker Pelosi says this is all about bribery, she's promised us evidence of bribery that would be compelling and overwhelming, and instead, it's invisible. I yield back.
Ms. Sewell.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to join everyone in thanking both of our witnesses for your service. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, as part of your policy portfolio in the White House, you maintain a relationship with Ukrainian officials, do you not?
That is correct.
You explained earlier in your testimony that your job within the White House was to coordinate United States and Ukraine policy. Is that right?
It is to coordinate United States policy vis-a-vis Ukraine, correct.
You testified in the spring of this year that these officials, these Ukrainian officials, began asking you, quote, advice on how to respond to Mr. Giuliani's advances, end quote. Is that correct?
That is correct.
What do you understand they meant by Mr. Giuliani's advances?
I understood that to mean both his public commentary, so publicly calling for investigations into 2016, Burisma and Hunter Biden, as well as his direct overtures to the government of Ukraine, directly and through proxies. That's what I understood.
And as you understand it, under whose authority do you think Mr. Giuliani was acting under?
Congresswoman, I don't know.
Did the Ukrainian officials you spoke to understand that Mr. Giuliani was telling them to investigate Vice President Biden's son and debunk the 2016 conspiracy theories?
I'm sorry, can you say that again, ma'am?
Do you think that the Ukrainian officials that you spoke to understood the underlying meaning of Mr. Giuliani's advances to be both investigating the Bidens as well as debunking the 2016 conspiracy theories?
Yes, I think to be clear, I think you're referring to debunking that it was Russian interference.
Exactly.
And
now, was this
somehow implicating themselves that it was Ukrainian interference. I'm not sure.
Exactly. Now, was this official U.S. foreign policy to push for investigation into the Bidens?
It was not part of any process that I participated in.
Now, Ms. Williams, do you agree that pressing these two investigations was inconsistent with official U.S.-Ukraine policy?
Obviously, anti-corruption reforms is a big part of our policy. I understand. I was not in a position to determine whether these particular investigations were appropriate.
That's fair. Colonel, is it true that President Trump directed the Ukrainian president on the call on July 25th to work with Mr. Giuliani on these investigations?
That is correct.
In fact, Mr. Giuliani has made no secret of the fact that he is acting on behalf of President Trump. As Mr. Giuliani told the New York Times, and I'm going to put this on the screen, he told them, quote, "My only client is the President of the United States. He's the one I have the obligation to report to, tell him what happens." He added that the investigations would be, quote, "very, very helpful to my client and may turn out to be helpful to my government," end quote. Colonel, is it fair to say that the Ukrainian officials that you are on a daily basis, well, you're in contact with, given your portfolio, were concerned about Mr. Giuliani's advances?
Yes, they were.
In your assessment, did they understand the political nature of the request being asked of them?
I believe they did.
Did they understand that it was affecting U.S. domestic policy?
I'm not sure what they frankly understood about U.S. I think they understood the implications. Yes.
Now, you testified earlier that you warned the Ukrainians not to get involved in U.S. domestic policy. Is that right?
I counseled them, yes.
Counseled them. In fact, you testified that you felt like it was important that you were espousing not just what you thought, but tradition and policy of the United States to say that.
It is what I knew for a fact to be U.S. policy.
Now, why do you think it's important that for foreign governments not to get involved in political affairs of a nation like the United States?
Congresswoman, the first thought that comes to mind is Russian interference in 2016, the impact that had on internal politics and the consequences it had for Russia itself.
Exactly.
This administration enforced sanctions, heavy sanctions against Russia for their interference, and that would not be in U.S. policy.
And so, Mr. Colonel, I'm running out of time. Is it normal for a private citizen, a non-U.S. government official, to get involved in foreign policy and foreign affairs like Mr. Giuliani?
I don't know if I have the experience to say that, but it certainly wasn't helpful, and it didn't help advance U.S. national security interests.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Turner.
Ms. Williams, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, I want to thank you also for your service. Your knowledge and expertise is incredibly important as we look to formulating policy with both our allies and to try to counter those who are not our allies. I think we're all very concerned about our European policy and how it can thwart Russian aggression. Ms. Williams, and you are responsible, as you said, as part of your portfolio, you advised the Vice President about Ukraine, correct?
Correct.
Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, you said that you are the principal, in your opening you say you are the principal advisor to the President on Ukraine and you coordinate U.S.-Ukraine policy, correct?
Congressman, in this statement I issued this morning, I probably eased that back. I took that off my job description that I have on my eval, but I certainly spent much more time advising the ambassador than I did the president.
But your statement, as you submitted it and read it today, says, at the NSC, I am the principal advisor to the National Security Advisor and the President on Ukraine, correct?
That is not what I read into the transcript. That might have been what I had in there yesterday when I was drafting it, but I chose to ease back on that language, even though it was in my evaluation, just because I didn't want to overstate my role.
You wrote what I just read.
But, Congressman, what I'm saying is what I read into the record this morning didn't say that.
Okay. Noted. Because you know Ukraine, you know that we work through our allies and our multilateral relations, and you know that the Ukraine is an aspiring member of the EU and NATO, right, Ms. Williams?
Yes, that's correct.
Lieutenant Colonel Vindman?
Yes, correct.
And you know that probably that the EU and the NATO both have offices in the Ukraine, and that we try to advance our policy with the EU and NATO. And you would agree that our Ambassador Kay Bailey Hutchinson and Ambassador Sondland would be responsible for advancing our policy interests with Ukraine at the EU and at NATO, right, Ms. Williams?
I would say that certainly in terms of this specific relationship between NATO and Ukraine, that would fall to Ambassador Hutchison, and between the EU and Ukraine to Ambassador Sondland. But obviously we have an ambassador in Ukraine as well.
Right. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, you would agree?
I agree with Ms. Williams.
Great. Now, Lieutenant Colonel, you said in your written statement that Mayor Rudolph Giuliani promoted false information that undermined the United States-Ukraine policy. Have you ever met Giuliani?
Just to be, again, accurate, I said false narrative just because that's what I said in the record this morning, but okay. I have not met him.
And so you've never had a conversation with him about Ukraine or been in a meeting with him where he has spoken to others about Ukraine?
No, just what I saw him, his comments on TV.
So news
and
reports.
in news, yes.
And similarly, you've never met the President of the United States, right?
That is correct.
So you've never advised the President of the United States on Ukraine?
I advised him indirectly. I made all his preparations for the calls and.
But you've never spoken to the President of the United States and told him advice on Ukraine?
That is correct.
So in your written statement, you said, in May, I attended the inauguration of President Zelensky as part of the President delegation led by Secretary Perry. Following the visit, the members of the delegation provided President Trump a debriefing. Well, that's not really accurate, right? Because the members didn't, because you were a member, but you weren't in that meeting, were you?
That is correct.
Okay, so we'll just have a note there that that meeting occurred without you. You do know that this impeachment inquiry is about the President of the United States, don't you, Lieutenant Colonel Vandeman?
I do, Representative.
Excellent. Now, you've said that you're responsible for coordinating U.S.-Ukrainian policy.
Correct.
Does the Secretary of State, Pompeo, report to you?
He does not.
Ambassador Volker?
He does not. We coordinate.
Ambassador of Ukraine, EU, NATO, Assistant Secretary for Europe, anyone at DOD report to you with respect to your responsibilities of coordinating U.S. policy with Ukraine?
Congressman, at my level, I convene what's called a sub-policy coordinating committee. That's Deputy Assistant Secretary. I chair those meetings. And
does anybody need your approval in your role on Ukraine policy to formulate Ukraine policy? Do they seek your approval?
According to the NSPM4, the policy signed by the President,
so he
policy
gets to
should
do
be
it.
coordinated by the NSC, correct. We help
Ms.
advise.
Williams, do you have any information that any person who has testified as part of this impeachment inquiry, either in secret or in public, has either perjured themselves or lied to this committee?
I have not read the other testimonies, and
So you do not. Do you have any evidence, though, that they have perjured themselves or lied?
No, because I have not read them.
Lieutenant Colonel Vandeman, do you have any evidence that anyone who has testified before this committee in the impeachment inquiry has perjured themselves or lied to this committee?
Not that I'm aware of.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Carson.
Thank you, Chairman Schiff. I yield to the Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Wanted to just make one point clear for folks that are watching the hearing today. Bribery does involve a quid pro quo. Bribery involves the conditioning of an official act for something of value. An official act may be a White House meeting. An official act may be $400 million in military aid. And something of value to a president might include investigations of their political rival. The reason we don't ask witnesses that are fact witnesses to make the judgment about whether a crime or bribery has been committed or whether, more significantly, what the founders had in mind when they itemized bribery or other high crimes and misdemeanors is your fact witnesses. It will be our job to decide whether the impeachable act of bribery has occurred. That's why we don't ask you those questions. For one thing, you're also not aware of all the other facts that have been adduced during the investigation. With that, I yield back to Mr. Carson.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you both for your service. Colonel Vindman, you were in a July 10th White House meeting in Ambassador Bolton's office. Isn't that right, sir?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
You were in a July 10th White House meeting with Ambassador Bolton.
Correct.
In that meeting, the Ukrainians asked about when they would get their Oval Office meeting, and Ambassador Sondland replied that they need to, quote, speak about Ukraine delivering specific investigations in order to secure a meeting with the president, end quote. Is that correct, sir?
That is correct.
Colonel Vindman, did you later learn why Ambassador Bolton cut the meeting short?
I did.
After Ambassador Bolton ended that meeting, sir, some of the group that attended a follow-on meeting in a different room in the White House called the Ward Room. Is that correct, sir?
That is correct.
And Ambassador Sondland was there with the senior Ukrainian officials. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Did NSC lawyers tell you to come directly to them, sir, if you had any other concerns after July 10th?
They said that, I believe the words were something to the effect of, if you have any other concerns, feel free to come back.
In this follow-on meeting, sir, Ambassador Sondland left, in your words, no ambiguity about what specific investigations he was requesting. Ambassador Sondland made clear that he was requesting an investigation of Vice President Joe Biden's son. Isn't that correct, sir?
That is correct.
and he stated that he was asking these requests in coordination with Chief of Staff, White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, correct, sir?
That is what I heard him say.
Colonel, in your career, had you ever before witnessed an American official request that a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen who is related to the president's political opponent?
I have not.
And Colonel, you immediately raised concerns about this, correct, sir?
That is correct.
What exactly happened?
After I reported it to the, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Could you say that again? I apologize.
You raised concerns about this, correct, sir?
Correct.
What happened?
To Ambassador Sondland, if I understood you correctly, I stated that it was inappropriate and had nothing to do with national security policy.
Did you also raise concern that day with White House lawyers?
I did.
What did you tell them?
I reported the same thing. That I reported the content of the conversation with Ambassador Sondland. At that point, I wasn't aware that Dr. Hill had a conversation with Ambassador Bolton. So I just relayed what I experienced to the attorney, lead legal counsel.
As we are now aware, sir, Ambassador Bolton expressed his concerns and instructed Dr. Fiona Hill, your supervisor, to also meet with the same White House lawyers to tell them what happened. Colonel Vindman, I agree that there is no question that Ambassador Sondland was proposing a transaction to Ukrainian officials trading White House meetings for specific investigations, with the full awareness of the President's Chief of Staff, White House attorneys, and his National Security Advisor. In my view, sir, that's appalling. Thank you both for your service. I yield back to the Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. I would just point out as well that when the matter does move to the Judiciary Committee and no decision has been made about the ultimate resolution, the White House, through its counsel, will have the opportunity to submit make a submission to the Judiciary Committee. I now turn to Dr. Wenstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Lieutenant Colonel Bidman, thank you very much for being here. As an Army Colonel who served a year in Iraq, I appreciate your service and the sacrifice that you made during that time, and I know the environment. And I understand and appreciate the importance of chain of command. In your deposition, you emphasized the importance of chain of command. You were a direct report to Dr. Fiona Hill and then Mr. Tim Morrison, and they were your seniors, correct?
That is correct.
When you had concerns about the 725 call between the two presidents, you didn't go to Mr. Morrison about that, did you?
I immediately went to John Eisenberg, the lead legal counsel.
So that doesn't seem like change of command. So in the deposition with Mr. Morrison, page 58 to 60.
Excuse me, please allow Colonel Vindman to answer.
Yeah. So I reported it to John Eisenberg. I attempted to report it to Mr. Morrison.
Okay, thank you.
He didn't avail himself. And at that point, I was told not to speak.
Well, he did avail himself, and I'll get into that.
Please allow the witness to finish. Colonel, are you finished with your answer?
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. In the Morrison deposition on page 58 to 60, the question was, do you know if anyone else on the call went to Eisenberg to express concerns? And the answer was, I learned based on today's proceedings, based on open source reporting, which I have no firsthand knowledge that other personnel did raise concerns. Question, who? Based on open source, without firsthand knowledge, Alex Vindman on my staff. The question then, and he reports to you, correct? Answer, he does. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman's direct report was Mr. Morrison, and it didn't happen. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, in your deposition, page 96, the question was, okay, after the call on 725, do you have any discussions with Mr. Morrison about your concerns? Answer, after the call, per the exercise in the chain of command and expressing, I immediately went to the senior NSC legal counsel and shared those concerns. That would be Mr. Eisenberg, correct?
I'm sorry, my lawyer was talking. Could you say that again, please, Doctor?
You went to Mr. Eisenberg. You've already said that, so we can go on. And you are not a JAG officer. You're not a lawyer. And on page 153 of your testimony deposition, in reference to that meeting with Mr. Eisenberg, you said, I was not making a legal judgment. All I was doing is sharing my concerns with my chain of command. Yet we've established that your direct report is to Mr. Morrison. So let's establish your role and your title. In your deposition, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, page 200, 201, in a colloquy with Mr. Stewart, You said, I would say, first of all, I'm the director for Ukraine. I'm responsible for Ukraine. I'm the most knowledgeable. And I'm there for the National Security Council and the White House. Are you the only one of the entire universe of our government or otherwise?